Hello. um, Hopefully people can hear me properly. I'm doing the normal sound check, etc. Great. It's a good way to start off. The iron brew bottle doesn't want to open. Going to drop the mouse. Even better. Okay, audio good. I wish I could say the same for this flipping drink. I really should have done this before, but that does not want to open. Let me put the mouse there. That there. That there. Let me see if I... Right, so hello everyone. Minor iron brew related difficulties aside, this is the Patreon live stream, which I think should have been, it should have been at the end of last month. Oh, there we go. Right. So, it's fairly standard rules. Obviously, we'll be going through the Patreon questions first, and then into whatever questions come from Super Chats and the stream generally. So if you do have questions from the stream, obviously probably best to hold them till after I get through the Patreon questions. But the other thing to mention is I'm thoroughly confused at the moment. So for those of you who are who have submitted Patreon questions, I'm aware that last time I think I answered the wrong month's questions. I've looked through these ones. I don't think I've answered these ones before. So I think these are a separate month's questions. I'm 99% sure, but obviously please let me know if you recognise them as having been answered before. But more broadly, if anyone can figure out which month I've missed after tonight, that would be great, because I'm really confused. Anyway, we shall commence. So Shazix asked, what if you were in command of the Titanic's maiden voyage would you do differently, assuming that you had no future knowledge? So basically, if Drydock was in command of RMS Titanic, what would I change? What would I do differently? To be honest, I think the main thing is I'd probably slow down a bit at night, because by the stage in the voyage that Titanic had actually reached, it was fairly clear that she probably wasn't going to get the blue ribbon on her maiden voyage, and therefore all you could really hope for is to complete it in a good time. Now, if that's your only real driving objective, then you might as well slow down at night. It's a little bit more fuel economical. It gives passengers a better night's rest, etc. That's if I have no future knowledge, that's probably the only thing I would change. At which point, when Titanic sees the iceberg, she's got a little bit more of a chance to actually, avoid the iceberg. But if at some point, for whatever reason, she doesn't avoid the iceberg still, the only other thing I'd do is I'd be like, the person who helped design and build this ship is on board. Maybe I should ask him what's going to happen. So that would be that. So Swee420 Den asked, how would the Pacific War look if Typhoon Cobra ended up being a divine wind a la the Mongol invasion and the whole of Task Force 38 disappeared into the sea? How long would it extend the war? How would the US and Japanese navies react? And do you think a loss of that magnitude could jeopardize the US Navy for the duration of the war and perhaps allow Japan to seek a negotiated peace? If all of Task Force 38 goes down, That's going to be hugely embarrassing because there's a lot of the US Navy's latest fast battleships and carriers there. It would extend the war because at this stage the carrier, the Task Force 38, is offering a lot of air support for the invasion of the Philippines. Also, with the complete loss of Task Force 38, the invasion of the Philippines is open to attack from whatever Japan has left, which would make US planners very, very nervous. Is it going to jeopardize the US Navy for the duration of the war? No. And this is the thing, the US Navy by this point is so ridiculously huge that whilst the loss of Task Force 38 would be the single greatest disaster in its entire history, they could, within a few months, have a force almost as powerful on station. They could bring enough carriers around to have a force as powerful on station, but finding quite as many fast battleships and some of their latest cruisers, that might take a bit longer. But then, of course, you also have the fact that going into the latter stages of the war, in our timeline, Admiral King wasn't particularly keen on the Royal Navy or the British Pacific Fleet being there. If the US Navy is lacking in a few departments as it's trying to rebuild after that, like, fast battleship escorts, he may be forced to change that tone slightly. And instead of operating as a separate force, they may just integrate the British Pacific Fleet into whatever the new task force is called, and then combined with obviously the huge amount of resources the US can still bring to bear, that new task force will probably be even more powerful than Task Force 38. So Japan's still not going to get a negotiated peace, but it's probably going to set the conduct of the war back several months. Yeah, some of the legacy noticed the background has changed slightly. I realised that the previous angle, which had the computer about 2 feet that way, you just got a nice view of this bookshelf and a bunch of wall. So I just slightly rotated everything, so you've got a slightly deeper look at the two shelves here. Oh, that's a swordfish. People asking in the chat. Jack Devaney asks, if for some hand-waving or magical reasoning either one or both of the Courageous class are not converted into aircraft carriers and updated to, say, early World War II standards, I'd love to see someone try that, what do you reckon their chances would be against something like Deutschland class? A Deutschland class is probably about the only thing I would give them a decent chance against, because the Deutschland's 6 11-inch guns, Courageous and Glorious 4 15-inch guns. The Courageous and Glorious are fast enough to hold the range. They have a significant speed advantage over the Deutschlands, and their 15-inch guns are more than capable of, absolutely hammering a Deutschland. Equally, they have no armour to speak of against the Deutschland's 11-inch gunfire, but they would be able to hold at a fairly long distance and conduct a very long-range gunnery duel, and there's not a lot that Deutschland can do to run or to close the distance in that regard, albeit that it's still 11-inch guns, so they probably, that's probably still at within some of the range of the Deutschlands. So it certainly wouldn't be pretty if the Germans got a lucky salvo and they'd been in a fairly difficult problem. The thing I'd really pay good money to see is quite how anyone would convert the Courageous class to early World War II standard, aka like Renown refit, because they had such flimsy structures and hulls when they were launched. I don't think there's a lot in reserve for you to convert. They might just fold up and snap. But that would be quite funny. Ukage asks, any chance of a Japan trip? What support would you need to do so? What museums and ships would you like to visit? And what materials would you want to get from Japan? Do you have any books or material you need to be translated? And if so, what's holding you back from getting them translated? Why not add a page on the site for foreign language material that you think needs to be made available in English? Okay, that's a lot of stuff. And let's go through it in reverse, I think. Why not add a page on the site for foreign language material you think needs to be made available in English? That's actually not a bad idea. The main thing I would need to do before setting that up would be, one, making sure that the material is available, within, copyright laws, etc. Now, that shouldn't be too hard, because an awful lot of the foreign language material I have lying around is in fact 100 plus years old, so it should be well out of copyright. There is some more recent stuff though, so I'd have to check on what the regulations are about getting that translated, while it's technically still in copyright. But the out of copyright stuff I could certainly put up. The main thing is I'd have to scan it first, and I'd have to scan it probably using my OCR capable scanner, because otherwise people would be just left with PDF or JPEG versions of whatever it is they're trying to translate, which could be a bit awkward. I think it would be better if people were able to actually just physically copy the text off the document. As far as books and materials you need to be translated, yeah, there's a fair bit. Now, in terms of a Japan visit, is there a chance of a Japan trip? Not this year. Next year, if the channel continues to do well, there is a decent possibility. So 2024. This year I have 2 more trips to America, plus a trip to Australia, and a bunch of stuff in the UK to do. So that's going to be a bit of a nightmare to sort out in and of itself. And spoiler alert, I'm probably going to have to at least look into some form of crowdfunding option for the Australia trip. So heads up on that one. Because, yeah, 3 trips to America and an Australia trip. The channel's doing well. It ain't doing that well. Not if I want to keep the lights on. But yeah, next year, what support would you need to do so, and what museums and ships would you like to visit? So I would have to make a full list of museum and ships that I'd like to visit. Because the thing is, like with going to the States or Canada or Australia, if I'm going that far, it's going to be at least 2 weeks, possibly 3. At which point I would like to get in as many museums and ships as I can. Obviously, there's the really obvious ones, the Yamato Museum, Mikasa, etc. But I'm sure there's plenty of others. I mean, it's like when planning for this Australia trip, we thought we'd see maybe 8 or 9 ships and/or museums, and then you do a bit of digging and it turns out there's an awful lot more. In terms of what I'd need to do so, well, I like to be as self-reliant as I can. So ideally, I'd like to just be able to turn up and make my way around, obviously having pre-negotiated with the museums, etc., for filming permissions. But considering that obviously Australia, Canada, and America all have the benefit of being English-speaking countries, and Japan is rather decidedly not an English-speaking country, someone who can translate would be really useful, I suspect, especially in once you're away from the museums and you're out in the high street. It's like, working out what is what, and making sure you go to the right places for food and so forth will be really useful. And yeah, in terms of materials, well, to be honest, the one thing I've learned from going to the States and Canada so far, and Sweden as well for Vasa, is basically don't bother having any expectations. And that's a positive thing, because I went to all 3 of those places with expectations of what material I'd get, and ended up coming back with far more than I'd anticipated being able to. So at this point, I'm just taking a point of view of, well, I'm going to show up and there's going to be cool stuff, and I'll try and get as much of it as I can. And that's going to be about the size of it, because otherwise I'll end up planning for something and end up doing something completely different, which then makes a complete mockery of doing the planning part anyway. Elliot W. James asks, if Task Force 8 successfully supplied Wake Island with aircraft and is returning to Pearl Harbor, the weather is better than historically, and Enterprise and her destroyer escorts are safely at anchor on the evening of the 6th. On the morning of the 7th, Enterprise is specifically targeted by the Japanese and sunk. Yes, that was pretty accurate, and is not salvageable. What effect would the loss of Enterprise have on the US Navy in 42 and 43? would the Americans ask for HMS Victorious, aka USS Robin, earlier? Bonus, you can spare one US battleship. Which one and why? Now, the thing is, with sparing a US battleship, it's not a particularly huge bonus, unfortunately, because all of the battleships that are there are the older, slower ones. And, well, you know, having one extra around doesn't change all that much. And when you might think, oh, well, why don't we spare West Virginia? It's a Colorado class. Colorado's obviously over on the West Coast. Maryland's not particularly badly damaged, so why don't we spare West Virginia? Then you've got all the Colorados around. Well, again, even the Colorados were on second line duty. So it doesn't change the tactical or strategic situation all that much to spare one. I suppose at that point it just comes down to probably spare Arizona because it spares the most lives. You know, without an overriding, this would really change the course of the war. I think that would be the priority. Then when we get to how would the loss of Enterprise affect things, it would be a huge, huge, huge effect. Because, well, you know, let's see, if without Enterprise, they're not going to feel safe enough to send Hornet on Operation Doolittle. Now, that could have good or bad effects. The Doolittle raid physically didn't achieve all that much. Psychologically, it had a bit more of an effect, but if there's not a Doolittle raid, then potentially Hornet is sent to Coral Sea instead. So you'd be going without the effects of the Doolittle raid, whatever you happen to interpret those to be, but maybe Coral Sea might be a bit more in the US's favour, or given that Yorktown was damaged, your Lexington was sunk, and obviously this was a stage before US Navy damage control really got going, you might end up with Hornet also badly damaged. Then going forward to Midway, which is obviously the three Yorktowns fighting together, but now you don't have Enterprise, and potentially you have a damaged Hornet, which actually puts the US on a significantly back foot when it comes to Midway. And then when you go into Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz Islands, Enterprise is key to the US efforts in the Guadalcanal campaign because the loss of Wasp, the eventual loss of Hornet, assuming that she hasn't been damaged or lost already in this alternate scenario. So, yeah, the US Navy would actually face flat out running out of active carriers before the end of 1942, at which point, you know, the fact the British offered one or possibly two carriers, they'd probably be jumping up and down trying to snap their arm off to get two, because they're going to need them. David B asks, it's been recognised that the South Dakota class was an amazing achievement on 35,000 tons. That's correct. What if the US Navy had built a 28-knot, 45,000-ton battleship alongside the Iowa class? Using Spring Sharp as a rough guide, it seems to be possible to get 3 quad 16-inch 45 calibers at 28 knots with the South Dakota's protection. Do you think this is realistically feasible? And also, what would the effect have been if these had shown up at the same time as the Iowas? How would they have fared against Yamato? Would Admiral Lee have rubbed his hands together in glee? Well, we actually do have some designs like that, that we do know of, that were put together in the initial run-up of the Iowa class design. Now, where is it? Now, annoyingly, my Freedman's US battleships is downstairs, and I know exactly where in that the sketch designs would be. But this is the Doolin and Garsky version. Doolin and Garsky US battleships. Here we go. Right. So, pretty much exactly what you're asking for. Fall 1937, this was at the beginning of the run-up of the Iowa class design. The 4-turret version of the South Dakota, standard displacement 45,000 tons, 770 feet long, 108 foot 3 inch beam, 35 foot maximum draft, 27 knots rather than 28 knots, with 170,000 shaft horsepower. Protection exactly the same as South Dakota, with 12 16-inch 45 caliber guns. The only difference between that question with 3 quads is that these are now in 4 triples, which I guess also explains the change in length. Then they've got the standard 25-inch 38 caliber guns, and given that this is a pre-war design, it has 12 quadruple 1.1 inch plus 12 50 cal. So apart from the turret layout, what you've asked for is pretty much exactly what the US looked for before they decided to head off in the direction of the fast Iowas. So it's entirely feasible. What effect would they have had if they'd shown up at the same time as the Iowas? I don't think a huge amount, because by the time the Iowas show up, they're basically running escort and shore bombardment missions. Of course, there are the opportunities to go after the Japanese battleships, which they don't get. There is, I guess, a possibility that if you have an additional class of 4 fast battleships coming along, so you now have the 2 North Carolinas, the 4 South Dakotas, the 4 Iowas, and these 4, there may have been enough fast battleships in theatre that Admiral Halsey might have actually left a screening force at the San Bernardino Strait waiting for Kurita. So we might actually have got the battle off Samar, in which case, yes, technically speaking, Lee would have been rubbing his hands together in glee for being able to fight that. The Hand of Ray asks, assuming for whatever reason the Pacific War does not occur, what would the Imperial Japanese Navy have looked like in the 40s, 50s and 60s? It's impossible to tell really what it would look like in the 50s and 60s. That's too far on a prediction. In the 40s, however, we do have the Circle 5 and Circle 6 programs to look at. So you would have had 4 Yamato class, 2 to the original design, Yamato Musashi, then Shinano and the unnamed 4th Yamato to a slightly revised design. You would have had the Super Yamatos. You would have had the B-65s replacing the Congos. You might well have had also, I mean, the Yamatos and Super Yamatos would also probably be phasing out the Fusos and the Iseis, but you might also have some other additional battleships being built to completely phase those out, leaving you with just the Nagatos as the legacy ships. They were getting back into heavy cruiser construction eventually. We know that their carrier program had basically kind of split, so they were looking at unarmored, higher capacity aircraft carriers, and also a series of armored flight deck carriers that were kind of Taiho and improved Taiho. We know that they were going with their destroyers as kind of going into a general purpose escort destroyer plus a dedicated anti-aircraft destroyer, which was Akitsuki, and then a dedicated torpedo attack destroyer, aka not Kitakami, Shimakaze. And basically you would have seen them phasing out all their World War One and early interwar stuff. So you would have had kind of Miyokos and Kageros and Nagato probably being kind of the oldest ships in the fleet. But to be perfectly honest, once you get past that, the next thing the Japanese Navy probably looks like is broke, because that's a huge amount of money they would have been spending for not a tremendous amount of return if they don't actually go to war with anyone. Well, that, and they would have run out of fuel, because the Americans had an oil blockade going. So if there had somehow not been a war, that kind of also predicates that somehow they persuaded the US to drop the oil blockade. Megascrow asks, for each major navy and the Dutch, what ship, if successfully scaled down to the class below, would have had the biggest or smallest effect? So 3,000 ton Dido or Spartan, yet maintaining most if not all of its capabilities. if the process of how the ship came to be like that matters, then sheer luck. No magic, alien tech, or anything. Ship successfully scaled down to the class below. So basically, what we're scaling cruisers down to destroyers. I don't think you can. I don't think you can scale a battleship down to cruiser size. I mean, if you just like run a Bismarck through a photocopier set to 40% scale, I guess you could end up with a Hipper or something that looks very close to it if you're also downgrading the guns. I suppose with the 3,000-ton Dido or Spartan, you're thinking about the 5 twin turrets. I mean, that could be done on 3,000 tons, I guess. I'd hate to see the stability calculations for it, but it could be done. Let me think. Well, you're not going to get triples on a destroyer. That kind of rules out scaling down US cruisers. I mean, the Leanders, a Leander scaled down to destroyer size is basically a tribal. And an Arethusa scaled down to destroyer size is basically a J class. Unless I'm missing something fairly major here. It's pretty difficult actually to think what would be useful, because most of the stuff is either, like I just said with those examples, is pretty much there's already a roughly direct equivalent, or it's going to be pretty much impossible to do. I suppose if you ran a King George V through and maybe had a 10 gun 8-inch cruiser with 2 quads and a twin and an emphasis on armor, I mean, it'd be interesting. And the British were a little bit short on cruisers. They always did want cruisers, so I suppose that would probably be the one they'd go for. For the US, as I say, you can't really scale anything down. The Atlanta's already an overgrown destroyer as it is. And the battleships is like, well, what's their layout? 3 triple turrets. Well, that's already a US heavy cruiser gun layout. Yeah, excuse me. I'm really stuck with that one, to be honest. I may excuse me. I think I'm going to have to park that one and ask you, Megascro, to send me some clarification on that one for exactly what kind of qualifiers you're looking at. Yeah. Okay, Michael Mann asks, if Congress had been persuaded to go up to 45,000 tons immediately when the escalator clause was invoked, how would this affect the South Dakota class? Would the ships largely stay the same with minor improvements? Would they end up growing to roughly the size of the preceding North Carolina class to reduce the cramped conditions and improve speed slightly, or would they be completely skipped in favour of the Iowa design? I don't think it's going to have a huge amount of effect, to be honest, on the South Dakotas, because you've got to remember with any battleship is that the design process and the long lead items extends quite a long time before the actual construction begins, before the keels get laid down. So okay, they were able to swap the North Carolinas over to 16-inch guns. That's fair. But it would be a very tight squeeze between the escalator clauses being formally invoked and the final design being completed for the South Dakotas to affect too many changes. I think the most reasonable thing would probably be that Yeah, you might see them just relaxing the strict requirements on the ships just a bit. So I don't think they'd build up to 45,000 tons, but I think they would make the hulls a little bit larger, and they'd just be a little bit more lax in overall weight. So you might end up with something in the 38 to 40,000 ton region, at which point you end up with pretty much a fully balanced, uh, a fully balanced capital ship, i.e., it's got reasonable speed, probably still say 28 knots, reasonable armor against its own guns, and 9/16-inch guns, pretty good firepower as well. Fletcher's fetching, fletching, fletchings, asks, what if the Norwegians had HMS Glatten during the Norwegian campaign? Do you think the ship would have affected German tactics, and how big a game changer would it be? I don't think the possession... This is an interesting one. It comes up occasionally. I actually really like this as an alternate scenario, because the only reason the Norwegians didn't get her back at the end of World War One was because the modifications had made her too large for their own dockyard. So if they either said, okay, we'll just maintain her overseas, or we'll expand our own dockyards, that's a fairly easy change to things. Overall, I don't think it would have actually changed German tactics at all. Because as far as the Germans would be seeing, they would be thinking, oh, well, the Norwegians have 3 obsolete World War One era coastal defence ships instead of 2. What a shock. They don't really mind about that. But once it gets around to the First Battle of Narvik, it would have a fairly big effect. Because, as we know, both Norgate and Eidsvold were taken out pretty quickly and pretty devastatingly by torpedoes, because they had basically no torpedo protection. Once you get Glatten into the mix, well, Glatten A obviously has more firepower and better fire control than her predecessors, but she also has absolutely massive great bulges, so the German destroyers could hit her with a torpedo, and she'd be like, that's nice, you have now demonstrated hostile intent. Now let me introduce you to the wonders of this fully armed and operational coastal defence ship. And admittedly, the Germans have enough torpedoes to eventually overcome her defences and send her to the bottom, but I have a feeling Glatten would probably take 1 or 2 destroyers with her, and probably damage a number more. Apologies, I'd forgotten about that. And that may very well actually mess up the German plans quite considerably, because if the destroyers go down during the First Battle of Narvik, they go down with their troops. Now, it's going to make the supply situation a little bit easier, because there's less fuel there's less destroyers to distribute the limited amount of fuel around. But it also means there's less ships available for when Warburton Lee's flotilla shows up, and even fewer ships available at that stage for when Warspite shows up. So yeah, it's going to leave the Norwegians on a much better footing. The only question is, at that point, can the Allies, because at this point Britain and France are still in the fight, can they exploit the fact they're going to win back Narvik somewhat easier? We're about a third of the way through the questions, in case anybody's wondering when it comes to the Patreon stuff. Avoid Shisnos asks, King George III decides that Parliament are being overly obstinate with the colonies and grants their wishes for representation, and directing the Royal Navy to make a major naval base in the Americas. Where is this base likely to be located, and what fallout will this new base likely cause for the Royal Navy and other navies of the day? It's probably going to be Boston, to be honest, because that is what the Royal Navy was using already. So when you look at pre-American War of Independence accounts, when Britain's at war with France and various other people, as it usually is, when you talk about combat happening in the Western Atlantic or in the Caribbean, or just patrols, ships go back for repairs, and they go back for R&R effectively to Boston, because there's already a fairly major dockyard there. So I think that would be, the Royal Navy would just go, oh, okay, well, we're already using this, and there's already enough space, and, well, the weather's very similar to home, so off we go, build up Boston as a major naval base. In terms of fallout for the Royal Navy and other navies today, I mean, for the Royal Navy, it's just going to be another very useful overseas base. So the immediate effect that in that respect is not too great. However, the Royal Navy is going to be tap dancing all the way to the stars with joy, because it means they retain easy access to the US forests, which means that they have ample supplies of good mast timber. So they don't have to rely on composite masts. They can have whole mast timber like they prefer. Interestingly, as a butterfly of that, you may also end up with, and this is only a possibility, I'm not necessarily saying it's going to absolutely happen, but you might not end up with the Battle of Copenhagen in 1801, because that was mainly fought because the League of Armed Neutrality looked to be threatening the Royal Navy's supply of shipbuilding material from the Baltic. And that trade really kicked off in the aftermath of the American War of Independence, because Britain had lost easy access to all those resources in North America. If they retain them, then that threat is much less. And that makes it much easier for the Royal Navy and Britain to just go, okay, well, we can negotiate through this. It might still lead to the battle, just on principle, or because of the additional demand of war, but it might change history there. West Coast asks, why not expand Halifax instead? Because it's further north. And as I said, Boston was pretty much the go-to for the Royal Navy when they controlled the entirety of the east coast of what is now Canada and America. So, better to work with what you've got. Scott Jennings saying, I remember this question from earlier. I do remember a question very similar to that, but I don't recall many of the other questions. So I think I am answering different ones. At least I hope I am. Patrick Donnelly asks, after exiting the San Bernardino Strait, Admiral Kurita's center force, instead of heading south towards Samar, instead turns north and heads after the Third Fleet. His reasoning being that with the Zoua's northern force distracting Halsey, he can close the distance during that battle and attack from behind. How close can he get to Third Fleet before they detect him? And if he did get the drop on Halsey, how much damage could he inflict before being buried under a deluge of bombs, rockets, shells, torpedoes and aircraft? And just for reference, Sean M in the chat asking, wasn't the main Royal Navy encouraging the Caribbean on Martinique? It varies over time. And the main anchorage in North America at Halifax, again, varies over time. Halifax becomes a lot more important once the 13 colonies go their own way. Right. But going back to Patrick Donnelly's question, how close can he get to Third Fleet before they detect him? I'm going to go with probably about 100. This is a complete ballpark guess, but I'm going to guess with about 100 miles before aerial recon notices him. And that's 100 miles from the screen, not 100 miles from Halsey specifically. If he did somehow get the drop on Halsey, and to be fair, most US aerial recon efforts are looking forwards rather than backwards. It will probably be an anti-sub patrol or something that spots Kurita. If he does get the drop on Halsey, the biggest problem Halsey's going to have is that Lee's battleships are even further ahead than the carriers for the most part. So Halsey would have to increase speed to maximum, which, to be fair, Essex class can outrun Kurita's fleet. So you'd basically have a larger scale version of the Battle of Samar, with the carriers hightailing it at maximum speed, gradually opening the range while Kurita does his level best to send shells out there, at which point it's a complete, dice roll of, does an 18-inch shell arriving aboard an Essex class is not going to be good news, and if one gets crippled by that kind of hit, it's going to be chewed up by the rest of Kurita's force, but equally you may not get any hits. And it's just going to be on a timer of how many lucky hits can Kurita land before Admiral Lee hauls his ships around and comes charging back the other way. Um, Todd Webb asks, if in response to the Anglo-German naval treaty, France for sure and possibly another treaty power because of wanting to exploit it insist on an escalation of heavy cruiser tonnage and gun limit in order to match the Deutschland class, what do you think the treaty powers would do if the London Treaty gets escalated to 15,000 tons and 11-inch guns? This is presumably for heavy cruisers. Probably cry, because that's exactly the kind of cruiser designs that everyone was trying to avoid being built. Also, given that the Germans are really the only ones with any recent experience in building 11-inch guns, I rather suspect that if that gets pushed for, people are going to say, well, you know what, why not 12-inch guns? Because we know how to build 12-inch guns. But on 15,000 tons, doing anything tremendously better than a Deutschland is going to be an interesting exercise, because you can make whatever ship you're building a bit faster, you can make it a little bit better armored, but there's no way you're building a 15,000 tonner that's going to be 11 or 12-inch gun proof, not unless you make a 21 knot coastal defense ship or something like that. But at 15,000 tons, you might because of the armor issue, you might actually see a lot of powers just going, actually, forget the slightly higher gun limit. And the US had some designs for 12-gun 8-inch cruisers with 4 triple turrets. They might go for those. Some of the British sketch designs for 9.2-inch ships might get built. Ships with 8 or 9.2-inch, you could probably fit with heavy cruiser armor on 15,000 tons. Yeah, it's yeah. Michael Griffith asks, if the submarines tasked with spotting the Midway defence carriers engaged and damaged them, would they have continued with surprise lost? How long would this have extended the war? So I'm presuming this is Japanese submarines spotting the US carriers. Would they have continued with surprise loss? I think it's not so much the surprise lost that's the problem. It's more the fact you've just had a bunch of long lances into your carriers. That in and of itself is going to be probably enough reason for them to turn around and go home, because one, you're not going to be able to operate at very high speed if your carriers have eaten a bunch of long lances, assuming they're still afloat. You're going to have to be doing some fairly serious damage control to make sure they're still afloat. And if you can't really operate significant numbers of aircraft, and surprise has been lost, and you're struggling to keep your ships afloat already, i.e., any Japanese counterattack is going to finish you off very easily, at that point it's going to be, sorry, we're going home ASAP. That keeping the carriers, keeping what's left of the US carrier force intact at that point is far more important than, unfortunately, defending Midway. Then the Japanese get to have fun trying to take over Midway. In terms of how long that would have extended the war, in theory, not hugely, maybe by a few months, because taking back Midway would be relatively easy for the US, certainly easier than taking it in the first place would have been for the Japanese. The bigger problem is going to be, one, making sure all the carriers survive and get patched up, and two, it's, without Midway, that means whenever you go back, you're going to have to fight another version of Midway against the Kido Butai, except now the Kido Butai are the ones on the defensive, and the further along into 42 you go, the further you start to enter into the sort of the shadows realm that happened in the middle part of that year when the Japanese changed their codes, and it took a while for US signals intelligence to get back on the ball and break those new ones, which obviously then puts the US at a bit of a tactical disadvantage compared to what they had at Midway. So that would probably extend the war more than anything else. I'd say probably about 6 months more. I think the main reason there's Jacob Austin's there saying there's not many super chats. I think the main reason, to be honest, is there's not so many people viewing, because I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to do this live stream until about half an hour beforehand. So the notifications only went up very recently. So I think normally with these things, the notification goes up like 12, 24 or more hours before, so there are more people realize it's happening. Plus, I think it's the evening of the release of the 2 mega Drydocks. So there's probably people still listening to those. Randy Topeka asks, what would Force Z have fared any different if Hood had survived and gone in place of Repulse? Probably not hugely. I mean, Hood does have a somewhat better anti-aircraft battery than Repulse, but not by enough to really massively affect things. She may have had even more AA because she was in desperate need of a refit, so she may have spent, the latter part of 1941 getting that refit. She's not going to be modernised up to renowned scale levels or anything like that, but Prince of Wales had most of the modern tech when it was working, and we saw how well that did for her. So yeah, I don't think it would have changed all that much with Hood in place of Repulse, with the exception potentially of if you've got Hood and Prince of Wales, which are both very valuable units, in place, then maybe the Admiralty would have advised a bit more caution. They may have been a bit more on the ball about things, but yeah, it's difficult to see anything massively changing if you just swap in Hood for Repulse, other than it'll take a few more torpedoes to put Hood down. So maybe more people will survive as a proportion. Paislitz asks, how does Bismarck's final battle change if they manage to fix the rudder right before the start of the battle? Again, probably not hugely. I mean, Schneider was getting very close to hitting Rodney, and Bismarck lurching around like a drunken sailor didn't help. But if you look at how many salvos Bismarck fired at Rodney and how close she was getting, her gunnery performance isn't out of line with typical battleship gunnery engagements or with Bismarck's own performance in previous gunnery engagements, which, to be fair, it shows you just how good a gunnery officer Schneider was, and that he was mostly able to overcome the issues that Bismarck faced. But the fact is also, Rodney was doing her level best to avoid getting hit, so you have to factor that in as well. And if Bismarck is steering a slightly more steady course, it does, of course, also make her a somewhat easier target. So she may actually get hit earlier, and once she does take the opening hits that she historically took, well, at that point, the fact that her rudder's working properly doesn't change all that much, because her fire control systems are very rapidly knocked out one after another. So it's probably not going to actually affect things dramatically, I think. I mean, if you get the rudder fixed completely, she might try and make a break for it, I guess. A last-minute break for it, which would force a chasing engagement. But that probably actually works out worse for Bismarck, because then she can only engage with 2 of her turrets instead of all 4. If the gods wanted us to be happy, they would have given us a honey-based alcoholic beverage. Oh, look, Mead asks, what... Okay, HMS Dreadnought is built along with 3 sister ships, Devastator, Defiler and Divine Wrath, all to the Dreadnought specifications. Okay, and which one is worse for everybody else? So either Dreadnought being built as a class of 4, Dreadnought is launched with a sister Devastator, but they're actually built to Iron Duke specs, i.e. 10 13.5 inch guns, or Dreadnought gets launched just one ship, but she's built to HMS Hood specs. I mean, I'd love to see how they managed to get the technology, but a Dreadnought being launched to HMS Hood specs would be the one that would make everybody flip the table, because, you know, Dreadnought being built, or 4 Dreadnoughts being built, is, you know, is neither here nor there, to be perfectly honest. That's kind of to be expected, if you like. 2 Dreadnoughts but to Iron Duke specs would be a bit of a kind of jaw drop moment, because that's within the realm of possibility in 1905, kind of, just about. But yeah, it's still an absolutely massive step change in ship design. Whereas if someone shows up and goes, right, we have, you know, we're going from 18, 20 knots and 4 12-inch guns on our battleships to 8 15-inch guns and 30 plus knots and armor that can withstand anything you can throw at us at the moment, that, you know, everyone's just going to be, okay, no, you know, that's kind of the rage quit moment for a lot of people. Warren Jervey asks, in September 1940, Japan and Germany reach an agreement such that Japan will deliver to Germany the Long Lance torpedo technology, along with an agreed number of fully functional weapons and 2 fleet subs. And in return, Germany will compel the Netherlands to allow Japan to take control of the oil industry facilities in the Dutch East Indies, together with the port facilities and a suitable number of airfields, naval facilities, military camps, as requested from time to time by Japan, etc., etc. If implemented, what impact would such an agreement have on the Battle of the Atlantic and the opening phases of any Pacific War? In terms of the Battle of the Atlantic, it's probably not going to have a huge effect immediately, because apart from anything, the Long Lance is a 24-inch weapon. Now, of course, you have the Type 95, which is the 21-inch version of the Long Lance used by Japanese submarines, so that would be more easily refitted into German subs. But if they literally just have the Long Lance torpedo tech, i.e. the 24-inch version, that's not going to help their subs too much. But on the other hand, you did say the technology, so let's assume it's Type 95s. I mean, it's going to make the German submarines marginally more lethal, but to be honest, the big advantages that at least in the opening stage of the Battle of the Atlantic, the main advantages that the Long Lance torpedo tech has in terms of range, speed, and also just in terms of the fact they're packed full of a lot of explosive, is considerably more effective against warships. A German torpedo, or a British torpedo, or a Japanese torpedo, or an Italian torpedo, or even a Mark 14 when they choose to work, are all perfectly good at popping holes in merchant ships. So I think the Germans definitely get the short end of the stick in this case. But, I mean, it will make them somewhat more lethal to the merchant ships, which isn't good for the Battle of the Atlantic. The Japanese, well, this is the thing, if the Japanese have somehow managed to get their hands on the Dutch East Indies via German compulsion of the Dutch government, however they're going to manage that one, I don't know, but let's just say they do, there probably isn't going to be an opening phase of the Pacific War, because the entire point of the opening stages of the Pacific War and why they had to launch it when they did was to get control of the oil facilities of the Dutch East Indies. If they have those anyway, why bother going to a big expensive war? Now, it's possible that, you know, if the US sees that now their oil blockade and embargo doesn't have any real teeth because the Japanese have the Dutch East Indies, they may then turn around and try and find some other reason to get involved in a war with Japan, but it's not going to be the same war as the opening stages of the Pacific War. Who starts it, when it starts, how it starts, you know, it's all going to be completely different and probably later than December 1941. Text us Anne La Choc. Around this time of year, I start seeing videos about the Muppet Christmas Carol and the little historical details they put into it that made it feel like you're actually in Dickensian London, albeit one populated by talking animals and Technicolor puppets. This got me wondering about Muppet Treasure Island, which was around the same time, a year or two after, I believe. Did that movie have similar attention to historic detail, or did they just say, you know, tourist rats on an age of sail ship keep making mid-90s pop culture references, why bother with history? I don't think I've seen Muppet Treasure Island. No, I have. I'm sure I've seen it, but I don't think I've seen it for like at least a couple of decades. So unfortunately, I'd have to go back and check. I would have to go back and rewatch Muppet Treasure Island, because for the life of me I couldn't give you a straight answer at the moment because I don't remember. Apologies, but please drop me a DM to remind me to actually watch the movie at some point over the next month. Jim Smitty. Okay, you're in the body of Alfred von Tirpitz just after he's requested to take over the German Naval Ministry. Admiral Frederick von Holman has resigned in 1897. As you meet with the Kaiser, you can't refuse the offer. You're now Naval Secretary of the German Empire. After a few attempts, you also realise you cannot sabotage your efforts to guide the German Navy. So stuck in 1897 as the head of the German Navy, how do you go about building up the German High Seas Fleet so that you can give Germany the best chance of winning the war that you know is coming? You retain all your future knowledge but can't affect foreign affairs except through your actions in the German Navy. So how do you do this? Well, if I retain all my future knowledge and I absolutely have to improve the chances of the High Seas Fleet, I'd say let's say my top 5 priorities would be to keep an eye out for the development of turbine tech and you know, do everything I can to get turbine technology, native built, German built turbine technology in place ASAP, because that will be a huge benefit. It means, you know, the Nassau's won't have to be entirely terrible. Second would be making sure that all of my main battery guns can elevate to at least 20 degrees. So I actually have range. And with, you know, increased range and better speed and turbines, etc., that's going to make my first dreadnoughts much more effective. What else am I going to do? So priority number 3, start building up quietly massive stocks of good quality coal, so that, you know, even if I'm not using it for day-to-day activities, I would want at least enough to coal the fleet for a couple of major battles, so that, you know, when the fleet goes out in an attempt to lure the British into combat, like in the run-up to what happened at Jutland, then they've got decent coal aboard. And my priorities for that, to be perfectly honest, will probably be to the faster ships first, so the battle cruisers and destroyers. That's third. Fourth priority, get them to drop the silliness with the 11-inch guns, just go straight for 12s. You know, there's no point in me really refining the pre-dreadnought designs because I know they're going to be obsoleted in 1905 anyway. But the Nassau's should have 12-inch guns, which, to be honest, if they've got turbine power plants, etc., should be much easier for them to do. And I think 5, if I can, I'd actually take a World War II Italian approach to fire control. So instead of, in the Germans' case, going for stereoscopic instead of coincidence rangefinders, I would actually say, you know what, let's have both. So have a stereoscopic and a coincidence rangefinder on the same rangefinder tower. Doubles up the amount of data I'm generating, and it means that my if I've got 2 sets of crew up there, at least one of them isn't going to feel like they've been worked over with a mallet to the head after 15 minutes. And so that'll hopefully dramatically improve my range finding accuracy. So those would be my top 5 things to do. So we are now... We're now, I think, 2/3 of the way through the Patreon questions. Hi Bacon Bomb asks, if all Soviet naval projects were able to be started and completed within reason, how would the Soviet Navy during World War II have fared against Germany, Italy and Japanese navies? And if Operation Unthinkable were to happen, how would they fare against British, French and American navies? Well, you say within reason because the Soviets were planning on having dozens of Sovietsky-Soyuz battleships. So if we assume within reason that they're starting and completing their projects, I mean, it's not actually going to do them all that much good. They'll have a few more destroyers. They'll have a handful more cruisers. But when you look at the laydown dates of the Sovietsky-Soyuz, it's very unlikely they're going to have them in service before the Germans invade. So, you know, the runs to and from Sevastopol might be a bit better because they've got more ships in the Baltic. The Luftwaffe will have more targets to go after in... Sorry, that's the Black Sea. The Luftwaffe will have more targets to go after in the Baltic. Yeah, this is the thing. A lot of the Soviet naval projects are happening right at the end of the 1930s, so they're just, within reason, they're just not going to be ready on time. If they then recommence them and finish a bunch of them, if Operation Unthinkable happens, I mean, it'll give them, you know, assuming that the quality control, etc., is somehow hand-waved as well, having the Sovietsky-Soyuzes or a decent number of them in the Baltic will make things a bit more problematic for the Allies if Operation Unthinkable occurs. But at the same time, you'd be talking about a Soviet Navy that would have a decent core of reasonable-ish ships, assuming that, you know, things like the rivets weren't completely and impossibly bad for poor quality control. But you're also going up against the end of World War II British and American navies, which just have insane numbers of ships and carriers, which, you know, no small force, however good, is going to really stand that well against. And there's a very high chance that, you know, even if they're started and completed, you're probably going to have, you know, Sovietsky Soyuz or one of whichever one was cancelled. I can't remember off the top of my head, because of poor rivet control quality. They're still going to have issues like that. Daniel Silverthorne, if you're placed in command of all Japanese Navy forces immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese army somehow is willing to work with you for the combined interests of Japan as a whole, how would you use Japanese naval forces coordinating with the army from December 41 to December 43 to try and bring about a resolution to the war that could actually benefit Japan? Okay, that's an interesting one. What would I do if I've got control from December the 8th to the 31st? Well, for one thing, I'd try and scale down operations in China to make them just kind of a holding action, because that will free up huge amounts of men that I can then push into the rest of the Pacific theatre. Would I get bothered going after Midway? Probably not. I'd probably maybe put a submarine blockade around Midway. Maybe have some cruiser squadrons do some raiding. But instead of doing... so instead of doing Midway, and before Midway as well, this is the other thing, I wouldn't split up my forces. So you have Coral Sea, and in some ways the US does get lucky because the Coral Sea force is escorted by only some of the Japanese carriers. I would probably just go with concentration of force. I would reason it as look, we know as the Japanese Navy, we have a smaller force than the US Navy, and we're going to have a smaller force as the US builds up, unless we can do enough to keep US numbers down. Separating our forces only really invites defeat in detail, so while we've got them on the back foot, best to keep that hammer blow together. So Coral Sea would be every operational Kido Butai carrier that I could get my hands on, which would probably end much worse for the US. I'd also drop the whole silliness about having, you know, the battleships escorting the landing forces and the landing forces being miles and miles and miles and miles behind the carrier. I'd bring the two a lot closer, and I'd move most of the capital ships to be screening my carriers as well. I mean, I'd leave a decent enough escort, but also by having by keeping the Kido Butai together at all times, I'd be able to have a decent enough combat air patrol at that point, with, you know, with a shortened distance, to have a combat air patrol permanently over the landing forces. So at that point, Coral Sea and the whole aiming to go after Port Moresby, etc., that's probably going to go a lot better for me. And then once I've devoted more men to that operation, and again moving as a very sort of big mailed fist, put as much effort as possible into taking and holding Guadalcanal, i.e. having more defenders available, etc., for when the US counterattacks, I would then try and establish my ring of defences. And yeah, I think at that point probably turtle up, if you like, because again, like, you know, the Burma campaign just ran on and on and on and on. I just sort of go, well, let's face it, we had years and years and years trying to pacify and conquer China. Do we really want to take on India at the same time? Probably not. We know that what's coming the other way, so, you know, let's turtle up and make ourselves the biggest, hardest, nastiest forces to crack. And then when the US begins its advance, I have more men, more fortifications, more guns, so more landing, more airfields, more aircraft, etc. So any attempt to attack and reduce my outer bastions is going to take a lot more effort, and because I still have the Kido Butai mostly intact, it means I can then run point defense from within that ring. So once the US forces tie themselves into a specific location by conducting landing operations, then I can swoop in with the entirety of the Kido Butai, including the Yamatos, etc., and hit them as hard as possible. That would be my suggestion. I mean, it's probably not going to help. It's probably still not going to win the war, but it's worth a shot. Redacted asks, if the London Naval Conference failed to reach an agreement, what would World War II look like? Presumably you mean the 1930 conference. Well, we know to a certain extent what was being prepared. So you've got things like the 16A battleship for the Royal Navy. Without the separation of 6-inch and 8-inch cruisers, then the cruisers are probably either going to stay at 8-inch or possibly even start escalating somewhat. It also depends in terms of, do they fail to reach an agreement on the additional restrictions that they put in at London, or do they just throw their hands up in the air and say, you know, we're not agreeing to anything at all, and let the Washington Treaty gradually expire? But you will in either case see, you know, the rise of the super destroyers. 2.5, 3,000 ton destroyers are probably going to become fairly common. You'll see a lot fewer 6-inch cruisers around. You'll see the early 1930s generation of battleships, which interestingly means that by the time you get to World War II, you're probably not going to have some of the oldest ships in the respective fleets around, because the Congo replacements the Japanese were looking at will be built. Arkansas, New York, Texas, basically all the non-standard US ships will probably be replaced by the early 1930s battleship build class. The British probably will, 13, 23, 33, yeah, the British will be putting 16As in to replace the Rs. So when you get to the latter stages, so North Carolina's King George V kind of period, those are going to be looking to replace the early standards, the Queen Elizabeths, etc., etc. And carrier-wise, the carriers are going to be bigger, because without the displacement limits on them, then you can get things like the size of Ark Royal being built for the British, Ark Royal size carrier with an armoured flight deck or something. The Americans don't have to build the Yorktowns down to, so you get something like a hybrid between a Yorktown and an Essex, and so on and so forth. Alternate historian Turtleduck. During World War I, how good was the Imperial German Navy's night fighting capability? And if they practiced as religiously as the Japanese Navy did in World War II, could they have decisively won the Battle of Jutland? The Germans' night fighting capability in World War I was probably, within reason, about as good as you could get. They had looked at that quite extensively. There's a few minor changes you could make, but that's kind of, it would be unreasonable to point at the Germans and say, look, here's a major weakness in your night fighting doctrine that you really should have seen and exploited. They had covered pretty much all the bases. If they practiced it as religiously as the Japanese in World War II, could they have decisively won the Battle of Jutland? Not really, because by the time night fell for the Battle of Jutland, they'd already lost. Everything else was just, set decoration. The other thing is, once they're on their way home, which is what Scheer wanted them to be doing, if you look at the state of the German fleet, half of them are battered, a lot of them are having to slow down because of bad coal fouling their boilers and everything. However good you are at night fighting isn't going to help you with any of those issues. And with all that, they don't have aerial scouting at night. They definitely don't have radar. Finding a target is going to be incredibly difficult. So, you look at the German performance in the night battles they did end up in, it was mostly pretty good. So, yeah, unless you completely hand-waved it away to include like a rabidly bloodthirsty Admiral Scheer who's determined to take his somewhat battered and running for home fleet and throw them into the middle of a night action for reasons, I don't think it's otherwise going to change all that much if Jutland goes as it historically did in terms of timing for the starting of the battle. I mean, they might aim, if they're really, really that obsessed, they might aim for a fleet battle at night to start with, but then that's not really Jutland. Meatwad asks, how would a hypothetical interception of Admiral Kurita's centre force turn out if he had called off the operation later than he did and Admiral Lee's Task Force 34 was able to arrive before he escaped? It seemed like it would be a more interesting fight since Lee was down to Iowa and New Jersey for his battle line, but Kurita had also had many damaged and sunken ships. That would be a rather interesting one, because if Kurita continues after Taffy 3, so he's heading further south, so his forces are going to become more and more spread out. If Lee shows up with initially, as you say, these two Iowa class, and the others, speeding to help him out, I mean, it's a little difficult to predict, because you would have the effects of continued attritional airstrikes from no one else, from Taffy 1 and Taffy 2. I don't think 7th Fleet is going to come up in time, and especially once Kurita decides to turn round. I think the interesting thing is going to be if Lee's got there with his 2 fast battleships and whatever escort's been able to keep up, what is his position going to be? And how much information is he getting from the other US forces? Because if Kurita's forces become spread out, he may be tempted to try and get in behind, because remember, most of the destroyers are going to be up front trying to attack Taffy 3. Lee might be tempted to get in behind and try and pick off the 2 northernmost capital ships first, or maybe double team on one and absolutely obliterate it and work his way down before Kurita can concentrate his forces again. Because, with Yamato, Nagato and 2 Congos there, 4 against 2 is never particularly good odds, and Lee knows that. So I think he he might, if I was him at least, I might, run in, absolutely hammer whichever capital ship gets caught furthest north, sink it or put it into a sinking condition, then take a calculated estimate of what's the next nearest one, can I hit it and badly damage or sink it before the other two catch up. If so, go for that. If not, break off and try and draw them north, because obviously that then saves the landings and the other taffy forces. It gives the other taffy forces more chance to continue hitting and slowing down or damaging or sinking Kurita's forces with more and more airstrikes, and it gives more time for the other ships that are following on to catch up. So his position gets better the longer things go on. So I think that would probably be his approach, would be to run in, cripple or destroy one or two capital ships, and then draw the remaining ones north and allow attrition to take its toll before moving in for the death stroke for the remaining ones. The Freaker 86, a follow-up on a previous question. Do you see any way that Prince Eugen and Nagato would not have ended up being nuked and thus turned into a museum ship instead in Japan or Germany respectively, or in the US? And if so, how do you think it would come to be? If the Japanese had, say, semi-scuttled Nagato in harbour, so rather than scuttlers in terms of fully sinking it, maybe identified a relatively shallow portion of the harbour where Nagato only drew 4 or 5 feet, and then scuttled her there, so she came down level as basically now an unsinkable gun battery. That would and sabotaged her engines. That would probably have left her as too much of a bother to refloat and haul over to an atomic testing range. Now, of course, then the question is, would she then end up being broken up in place before someone is able to turn her into a museum ship? But it would give her the best chance of that. With Prince Eugen, then you're, again, similarly, once she's in the US, her fate is almost inevitable. So with her, maybe it would be a case of, instead of they bring Prince Eugen over, then they send her crew back, and then the engines seize up, maybe it'll be a case of they dismiss the crew while she's still in Germany, they try to sail her out, the engines pack up, she's left adrift in the North Sea, at which point she probably gets towed into some British port for the minute, and then maybe kicked back to Germany to deal with, again, probably to be broken up, but she's back in, roughly speaking, her home territory and has a better chance of being made a museum ship. So yeah, it's basically mechanical failures making them far too much like hard work to actually get to the area. Miles McCaskill. Which salvo fired do you think had the greatest impact on human history during the Age of Sail or Steam, and why? Or which three, if that makes answering the question either. Which salvo fire do you think had the greatest impact on human history during the Age of Sail or Steam? Yeah, I think top three might be a little easier. So, in general terms, the salvo that opens the Battle of Tsushima, not because of necessarily its impact on the overall Russo-Japanese War, but because it takes out so much of the Russian Imperial Navy that you see the effects. The effects are still ongoing when you get to World War One. The Russians are operating on a complete back foot, even against partial forces like the Ottoman Navy or the bits of the High Seas Fleet that get sent after them, especially since they lose so many of their Borodinos. If the Battle of Tsushima hadn't taken place, then and through various shenanigans the Russian Navy was preserved, they'd at least have more ships available with which to fight World War One, which could have reasonably changed the playing field of who does what and where in World War One, so that would be fairly important. Also, marks the start of the decline of Russia as a major naval power for the 20th century, for a good chunk of the 20th century, at least past the period where the channel covers. So that would be one. And that's in terms of it starting a battle. In terms of a specific salvo firing, that in and of itself, that particular batch of shells having an impact on human history, well, Bismarck firing the salvo that blew up Hood has certainly caused huge amounts of air and ink to be wasted arguing over the Battle of Denmark Strait for all time. So I guess there's that. What else would you have? Impacts on human history of a single salvo. Well, I suppose in impacts not had, you could always look at one of the salvos that didn't kill Nelson, whether you want to go with the one that took his eye, the one that took his arm, the several others that injured him. What the impact on human history might have been if Nelson was departed rather forcibly off the mortal coil several years ahead of when he historically was, and therefore wasn't around for Trafalgar. That could be it's not a salvo that had the greatest impact, but it's possibly the salvo that had one of the greatest non-impacts or potential impacts on human history. All right, Shazix asks, oh no, he's already had a question. So he had a question at the beginning. So Sam Signorelli asks, if you could pick any ship versus ship engagement, which would you most like to see? You get to okay, so this isn't a historical one, this is one I get to set up myself. You get to set the weather conditions on whatever ships you pick to have the normal escorts. The ships involved do not have to be contemporary, so you don't have to have Johnson versus Yamato. You could have Johnson versus Victory. So it's a force v force rather than single ship v single ship. If I could pick any action you'd most like to see. Oh, okay, right. I think it would be a tiebreaker between Admiral Lee and Task Force 34 versus Kurita and Center Force, because that will be kind of the wrapping up of the wrap up of the battleship age, basically the last great battleship action. The other two contenders would be either Battle of Jutland 2 Electric Boogaloo, aka the Battle of Texel, the High Seas Fleet with its two Bardens going up against the Grand Fleet with everything, the kitchen sink, and 6th Battle Squadron, aka the division of the US Navy that had shown up. That would definitely be one to see. And I think maybe coming in a slight, those would be my top two, and maybe as a sort of a wild card one would be what if one of the albacores during the Indian Ocean raid hadn't been damaged or shot down, so Admiral Somerville knows exactly where Carrier Division 2 is, and then you get Warspite and 2 armoured carriers in a gunfight with Carrier Division 2 and its escorts in the middle of the night. So, as I've said a few other times in various other videos, what if the first carrier versus carrier battle was a gunfight at night? Coneled asks, as an American, I like to measure things in anything but metric units. Since Yamato's 18-inch shells are a reasonable representable fraction of Johnston's mass, I wonder how many USS Johnstons did Yamato fire at Samar, And what battleship fired the most USS Johnstons in anger during World War II? And how many Johnstons did it shoot? It's not the 18-inch shells that are a reasonable fraction of Johnston's mass, because I mean the Yamato's shells are 3 and a bit thousand pounds. Johnston is like almost 2,000, well, over 2,000 probably at that stage, tons. So yeah, that's because I think what you may be getting confused by is the fact that Yamato's turrets weigh more than each individual of Yamato's 18-inch turrets weighs more than Johnston does. Because yeah, Johnston's mass, say it's a bit over 2,000 tons. 16-inch and 18-inch shells are a little over a ton apiece. So to, even if you fire several hundred, you're only firing like 10-15% of the mass of a Johnston. In terms of which battleships fired the most Johnstons in anger, it's going to have to be one of the ships that did shore bombardment. Maybe one of the ships like Warspite or Texas, which during the D-Day operations, and D-Day itself and the subsequent operations, emptied their magazines and cycled back like 2 or 3 times, because at that point, between their entire magazines, they would have been firing off. They would have been firing off maybe several thousand rounds, which would equal the mass of a Johnston. So, I mean, because the thing is, like, Warspite's there for with several different European bombardments, but then Texas and a bunch of the US ships are there for multiple multi-day bombardments in and around the Pacific. So, I mean, without looking up the exact figures, my ballpark would be that maybe one of the more active shore bombardment battleships in the Pacific War would be the one that's fired the most. And I would reckon you're probably looking at maybe 3 or 4 Johnston's masses of shells over the course of the war. And then lastly on this one, we have Chris Balance, who asks, rumours are percolating that Bob Iger wants to get Johnny Depp to return as Jack Sparrow. Whether or not these whispers prove true, which historical or fictional pirate captain would you like to see on the big screen? And do you have a pick for the actor? I don't know about fictional. Historical, I mean, I know I think there have been some Blackbeard movies done, but a full Hollywood Blackbeard movie would be quite funny, I think. You would have to, I think, I mean, with any historical pirate movie, if you're actually going to do a historical pirate movie, it would be horrific. It would be like R-rated, 18-rated, whatever the local equivalent is. If you kind of tuned it and fictionalized it enough that it could get like a 12 rating or a 15 rating, and get some of the worst elements out of the way, then yeah, then a Blackbeard movie could work, at which point maybe get someone like John Rhys Davies to be Blackbeard. That would just be funny. Right, and I believe that is those Patreon questions. Now, as I mentioned, in terms of Patreon questions, I did get it mixed up last time. I think I've now corrected the mix-up, and we should just be on to Patreon question when I do a stream maybe next week. We'll be doing the Patreon alternate history questions for this month's Patreon Drydock, which has come out. But if you happen to be on Patreon and you think I've completely messed it up and left out an entire month's worth of alternate history questions, again, please drop me a message. I'll try and sort that out. If you think I've missed a question of yours at some point, please let me know. I know there are a few questions that I do need to kind of do a catch up on from clarified questions and so on and so forth. Yeah, Splendid Dictator, John Rhys Davies and Brian Blessed as pirates. That would be great. My only concern is Brian Blessed is getting on a little bit. But yeah, which is why I chose John Rhys Davies. If we were talking 15, 20 years ago, Brian Blessed as Blackbeard would be absolutely hilarious. Actually, there's a point. I should really try and meet Brian Blessed at some point. He's a cool guy, and I think he lives somewhere in the vaguely near area. Anyway, right. Right, so now I'm going to try and get through the super chats so we can get into the main chats, or the, you know, the chat stream, you know what I mean. Anyway, the crazy one. If you could dive on any shipwreck, which one would you dive? Royal Oak. That for, well, hopefully most people understand why. I was supposed to get my scuba diving qualifications recertified this year, well, last year I should say. That didn't happen. I'll be interested to see where we're going to find the time this year, but I desperately do need to do that and get myself a new dry suit, because let's just say the one that fit me when I was 20, yeah, that don't fit anymore. Not unless you want to see what Drac looks like when you've been sprayed in latex, which, trust me, you don't. So yes, Royal Oak would be my choice of diving shipwreck. Stephen Cole asks, thanks for your video on the evolution of carrier air wings. I'm glad to help. I'm building a 1 to 200 Yorktown model. Now I know how many aircraft to add for it from Midway. Well, if you want to drop me an email, I do actually have the full table that I use, because for each of the battles, obviously, I use the average figures. So for Midway, it was averaged between Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown. I did mention some of the details of specific carriers, but yeah, as I say, drop me an email and I'll send you the Excel spreadsheet that has each individual carrier's air group broken down by type as well. Madeline Dowell, where can I find more information on World War II amphibious operations, both European and Pacific theatres? Oh, now that's a good one, because that's right at the edge of what I cover, because it's literally right on the edge of the sea. Let's have a look. What could I recommend that's in easy reach? Ships. See, I don't tend to have a tremendous amount on the actual amphibious operations. I'm sure I've got something on DAP around here, though. Destroyer battles? No. British warship design, Clydebank battle cruisers. Oh, that's Jutland. Battles Denmark Strait. Something over here might be a bit better. Armoured cruisers, no, that's not going to help. Fletcher class, also probably not going to help. Airships in international affairs, that's definitely not going to help. Carriers or Arctic convoys, war beneath the seas, that's subs, that's not going to help either. I think my my campaign shelf is over there. So I would say drop me an email and I'll try and recommend some sources for you. I'd say amphibious operations are not particularly my strong suit because of the heavy army and air force involvement. They're somewhat less interesting to me than full naval operations. But I'm pretty sure on one of the campaign shelves there is a bunch of stuff I can recommend for amphibious ops, especially things like Gallipoli and D-Day. There's a huge amount written about those for obvious reasons. Bardley Richard, thank you very much. BR Class 47. Did World War I Germany or anyone ever think of building an aircraft carrier that carried Zeppelins? Also, what do you think of the Azure Lane Royal Oak design? I don't know what the Azure Lane Royal Oak design is. I'm going to put it into Google search and probably regret it. That's actually not terrible considering the genre that sits in. I actually think that's actually a relatively nice and tasteful tribute, to be fair. I'm pleasantly surprised. Now, going back to the other part, did anyone think of building an aircraft carrier that carried Zeppelins? No, because Zeppelins were usually actually larger than, at least lengthwise, they were actually larger than a lot of the early carriers. But a lot of early carriers did have the capability of supporting Zeppelins. So there's a fairly commonly seen picture of, okay, it's not a Zeppelin, but it's a largish airship on the back of Furious. There are some slightly hard to find but out there pictures of the Lexington class with various US Navy airships parked on their decks. So there were carriers that could support Zeppelins, but to be perfectly honest, a carrier can't really carry a Zeppelin because the sheer size of the things and the amount of wind resistance they have doesn't work with ships pitching up and down constantly at sea at high speeds. And or, you know, can you imagine trying to get a Zeppelin tied down to a carrier in the middle of a storm? That would probably end up with the loss of both. Fushi Smith asks, how was the America trip? The America trip was superb. I got to meet a bunch of people. I think I've noticed some people in the chat were there. That was really, really fun, meeting up with people. I got to revisit a bunch of ships that I've seen before, which was cool. Pick up some new material on that. I got to spend time with people I'd met before, which was also absolutely awesome. I got to attend the Vince O'Hara's Western Naval History Association conference. I got to meet Norman Friedman. You know, how cool is that? And also, I didn't not just get to meet him, I also got to talk with him at a reasonable degree of length. I also got to talk with Vince O'Hara, Len Hines, Steve McLaughlin, loads of naval authors that you've already probably heard of. I got to talk with all of those, and I got to listen to lots of interesting presentations. I got to meet a bunch of even more interesting people. You know, that was really fun. And of course, I got to go crawling around inside USS Texas. I got to see a battleship in a dry dock, and not just any battleship either. So yeah, to be honest, the only downside of the only negative thing in the entire America trip was, one, I couldn't see as many ships as I wanted. Well, actually, I say there were three downsides. One, I couldn't see as many ships as I wanted, but you know, that's time. Two, I wanted to film a bunch of stuff with Dr. Skulls. Unfortunately, he became ill just before I left. So I'll have to do that either by remote interview or I'll have when I pop back in September, I might be able to talk to him then. So that's, you know, it's not what I necessarily wanted to do, but it's not a huge problem. It's something that we can easily overcome. The only really big annoying thing was Avis, the car hire company, because I needed to hire 3 cars while I was in the States, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, and one in Texas. And Avis were the car hire company for the West Coast and for Texas, and they managed to screw things up twice, which ended up costing me a fair amount of money and time. So they're not in my good books. But other than that, I mean, I even had a decent experience with Spirit Airlines, which is apparently rare, from what I gather. Weirdly enough, the JetBlue flight from Houston to Boston was overall a better experience than the Delta flight across the Atlantic. JetBlue really surprised me, actually. At least the aircraft I was on was really well appointed. Fleet of Oceans. What do you reckon Sweden comes up with if they decide not to build the Sverige and build a pair of small or not dreadnoughts instead? Well, economically wise, if they're building dreadnoughts, they are going to be building small ones. They're probably still going to want shallow draft to fight in their country's coastal regions, at which point I think you're probably going to just see an expanded Sverige design. So maybe having 4 twin turrets makes it a true dreadnought, and then probably a considerably larger vessel than what you'd think you'd need to mount 8 11-inch guns in order to, in terms of length and breadth dimensions, in order to keep that draft shallow with a decent amount of armour. So, what, something in the 15 to 18,000 ton range, probably, I would say. Aero asks, ships in current times fly under flags of convenience. Was this the same back in World War I and II? Did flying under the flag of some other country provide any sort of protection for transports, or did they just get sunk regardless? It depends. In some parts of World War I or World War II, flying under a flag of convenience would give you some protection. So if you were flying under an American flag at some points in World War One, and technically very small parts of World War II, that would give you some protection. Flying under a Russian flag was quite useful for a while, because if you're flying under a Russian flag, at least until Hitler invaded Russia, the Kriegsmarine would leave you alone. And during almost the entirety of the Pacific campaign, flying under a Russian flag meant both the Japanese and the Americans would leave you alone, friendly fire incidents accepted. But more generally, in World War One, once unrestricted submarine warfare opened, and in World War Two, just generally speaking, if you were heading for the UK or the US, a U-boat would sink you regardless, most of the time. DJ Medeiros asks, is it true that technically the US fired first, with USS Ward firing at Pearl Harbor? And if so, could they be posthumously awarded a citation for the first enemy combatant sunk before hostilities began? I mean, who exactly fired the first shot of the Pacific War is something that people argue about constantly. In the context of the Pearl Harbor attack, Ward firing on one of the Japanese midget submarines would technically constitute the first shot fired for that attack. Whether or not it's the first shot fired over the Pacific campaign as a whole, that's another issue. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, it depends how you want to define the start of hostilities, because, well, firing on and sinking a submarine that's trying to infiltrate your harbour to blow up your ships, that would count as hostilities. I mean, several hundred aircraft showing up and actually blowing up your ships is a little bit more definite an opening of hostilities, but either way. So, yeah, I mean, if Ward doesn't have some kind of citation for, firing the opening shot of the December 7th engagement, maybe she should have one. Sven Rucker asks, what would the German fleet have looked like if Germany had joined the naval treaties in the late 1930s and Japan still leaves in 1936? Basically what it looked like in 1939, because with the Anglo-German Naval Treaty, they did join the naval treaties, technically speaking. They even had a tonnage allowance and everything. This, I think, is also covered in today's Patreon, in today's recorded Drydock, the one that went up earlier today. Basically, despite what some people say, the various articles in the Anglo-German Naval Treaty of 1935 do commit Germany not just to building to approximately 35% of the tonnage of the Royal Navy, but also commit it to obeying the restrictions of the naval treaties. Section 2, Part D is the big one that you need to look at. So, yeah, the Anglo-German Naval Treaty in 1935 is basically the Germans joining on a, approximately speaking, 35% basis. So that would be 35%. I calculated that would give you 5 and a bit battleships, which is somewhere between 1% 5. It's putting them roughly on a par with France and Italy in terms of what they're by treaty allowed to build. Yeah, it's putting them on about the ballpark of France and Italy, and they do commit to various tonnage limits and everything, which is specifically why they say in 2 Part D and elsewhere of the Anglo-German Naval Treaty that they reserve the right to slightly adjust from strictly 35%, because if they build 35,000-ton battleships, because they say we will keep to these displacement limits, well, they're going to end up with like a quarter of a battleship left over. So they were going to go, okay, well, we'll take those few thousand tons and put them somewhere else. So that might take us slightly over 35% in another department, but at least we get whole ships out of it. Togfather asks, US cruisers carried several float planes. They also had scout squadrons on their carriers. Did they also use the cruisers' planes as scouts, and did this change once the VS squadrons were scrapped? So the VS squadrons' scout aircraft were generally higher performance than the cruisers' float planes, mostly because they didn't have to carry around a bunch of floats with them. So when it came to where carriers were available, the carriers usually would organise the scouting, but the cruisers' planes were used as scouts when the carriers weren't there. Also, even when the carriers were doing scouting operations, the cruisers' planes were often used as more local scouts for things like anti-submarine patrol and so on and so forth. Occasionally, you'd see a cruiser scout plane being chucked out on a more distant scouting patrol, but usually if a carrier was there, using a Dauntless was a better option than using a Seagull. Once the VS squadrons were scrapped, well, remember they were just incorporated into the VB squadrons, at which point the carriers were still taking on the bulk of the scouting work. It's just that it was much easier to just go, okay, well, will put a 500-pound bomb or possibly even no bomb on this Dauntless, and hey, guess what? You're going on scouting duty, as opposed to this other Dauntless, which we're sticking a 1,000-pounder on, and that's on strike duty. Fushi Smith, how is a Kai-10 operated? Poorly. If you've ever seen the Kai-10 in Pearl Harbor or read about them in extensive detail, you'd understand. But basically, there's a guy in a little conning tower, and in theory, the Kai-10 operates in a kind of a semi-submerged state, so that he can actually see where he's going. But he basically just has a very simple set of controls, depth, and mostly direction and throttle. But yeah, the problem with Kai-10s is they're not actually particularly quick. They're much easier to spot than regular torpedoes. They're much easier to stop than regular torpedoes. And the view out of the control chamber is absolutely awful. So you're more relying on luck than judgment to operate a Kai-10 at all, which is why, despite their on paper capabilities, they actually get very, very, very few hits for the numbers that are launched. Sapper Ninja asks, if the US Navy had needed another USS Robin in late 1942, what could have been sent? If you could choose any operational Royal Navy carrier, what would you send? Well, in late 42, well, you've got Victorious, obviously, which is the one that is historically sent. I'm just trying to think, because by late 42, you've got a series of Royal Navy, I mean, Royal's long gone, but you've got a series of Royal Navy carriers that have been deployed to the Mediterranean, damaged in the Mediterranean, and are getting repaired. You've got Illustrious, Indomitable, and Formidable as the armoured carriers. I don't think Implacable's really ready to go yet. You don't... I mean, objectively, it is possible to say, yes, you could send Furious. But I'm not sure if the US Navy would be particularly thrilled if they did. Without checking, I'm going to go out on a limb a little bit and say that maybe Formidable would have been available. but I'm fairly sure they would. I'm pretty certain that at least one other carrier would have been available. Oh, Unicorn, actually, Unicorn would have been available. So yeah, you could have sent Unicorn, and it should have done all right. BR Class 47 saying Argus. Well, if the US Navy is not going to be thrilled by sending Furious, the British offering Argus with the best will in the world. You know, Argus is a decent enough second line carrier, but if the British turn around and say, yeah, sure, we'll send you Victorious and Argus, the US Navy is going to be very convinced this is some kind of backhanded insult. Cajun Y says, come visit USS Kidd. I definitely do want to visit USS Kidd. I'm currently in the middle of, well, I'm not in the middle of, I'm tentatively beginning to put together my schedule for September, because I'm back in the US in September. So we shall see if we can get Kidd into that. Ramal says, when is the next live segment going to be? If you mean within this stream, we're on to the super chats, and then once we've done that, which there's a couple left, and then we'll be on to taking chats from the stream. If you mean when is the next live stream going to be, hopefully in a week or two, so that I can get the February Patreon live stream done, and then we'll actually be up to date for the first time in like 6 months. And it's only 10 o'clock UK time, so we will actually have a fair amount of time to take questions from chat, assuming that Mrs. Drack doesn't come and drag me downstairs. So that was Cajun Y. Animal 16365. You're given a choice between a sword, mace, spear, hockey stick, stun gun, or shock collar, and you're locked in your room with BT. Which would you choose? Shock collar. I would put BT under Pavlovian conditioning to remember signals, to the point that if, you know, once I'm done with BT and my shock collar, whenever he goes around and he sees anything other than a perfectly arranged signal, he's going to end up with PTSD flashbacks, to the point he may actually abandon the command track altogether and just become a signalman. Bud Guy 8829. Oh, sorry, just quickly, just spotted that one. Wayland Chow, how was the naval conference? As I mentioned earlier, absolutely fantastic. And did you enjoy the Girl Scout cookies? Yes, I did. I basically, the s'mores ones were my sugar imbibement for the second day of the conference, and the other two packs I consumed most of one before I got back, but I noticed one of them was gluten-free, so I kept that one with me, and I'm sharing it with Mrs. Drack at the moment. Going back to Bud Guy 8829, how close were the Montana class to being built, and do you think the 30-knot version should have been built instead of the Iowa class? I don't think the 30-knot version should have been built instead of the Iowas, purely because, well, let's face it, the Iowas did get a little bit late into the action in World War II. The 30-knot long tanners would have taken even longer to build, and therefore would have seen even less service in World War II. And being much bigger and much more expensive to run, there's less chance that they would all still be here. So, you know, with perspective, it's probably just as well. In terms of how close they came to being built, well, they were authorized and they were laid down, but they ended up being suspended because of the problems, well, not problems, but basically a combination of budget and a steel shortage. So, you know, they got about as close as you can get to being built without actually having, you know, the frames 60-70% complete and then being scrapped on the slipways. So yeah, if the US had decided, you know, actually we don't need quite as many Essexes, we're going to build a few battleships instead, then the Montanas could have been built. Graham W. Kidd, less a question and more of a request. ANZ is either working or going to work. Can we please avoid Monday morning lives? Don't want to miss them. Whoever ANZ is. Oh, do you mean New Zealand? Perhaps. I guess, yeah, I suppose in the Antipodean regions, this probably is Monday morning, isn't it? Well, the thing is, most of the time, if I do a live, it's either going to be Saturday evening or Sunday evening. Saturday evening, this evening that just gone, because this is Sunday evening, obviously, for me. Saturday evening was basically a write-off because jet lag has been really vicious with me this time round, which was a bit weird because jet lag was bad Tuesday. I landed like 6:30 in the morning Tuesday. It was bad Tuesday, really bad Wednesday. I think what happened was I had bad jet lag the first 2 days. I then Thursday, Friday forced myself to work through the whole of Thursday, Friday and half of Saturday to get the Patreon Drydocks recorded, done and uploaded, which is why they uploaded a little late on the early release. And I think what I should have done, well, from a purely medical perspective, what I should have done is probably spent Thursday recovering as well. As a result, the built up jet lag that I didn't recover from on Thursday hit me on Saturday. And to be honest, a little bit also today, but there you go. But yeah, ideally I do prefer to do these things on Saturday evenings if I can. Fleet of Oceans asks, have you seen the new concepts for Leviathans of the Skies aerial warships? I, for one, am very excited for what they've shown so far. Yes, I backed Leviathan's Kickstarter, if we're thinking of the same one. At this point, I should check up on what their production progress is. I've got a bunch of the previous releases models, but not in here, I think. I think they're elsewhere. They're with my Dystopian Wars stuff. Zeb Wood asks, did the Nordic countries have any differences in coastal defence ship operational doctrine? It seems most had similar capabilities. Yes, they did. I mean, you can see that in the different kinds of defence ships. The Norwegian defence doctrine, with the best will in the world by World War II, the Norwegian coastal defence doctrine seemed to be hope and pray that no one comes after us. The government really hadn't paid all that much attention to upgrading their capabilities, which is why you end up with Norge and Eidsvoll having so many major weaknesses when it comes to the first Battle of Narvik. The Royal Norwegian Navy has a lot of spirit, but is really, really hamstrung by effectively 2 decades of neglect. The Swedes probably have the most advanced operational doctrine, because they've got this whole program for littoral warfare centered around the Sveriges. They've got Gotland. They've got destroyers that are designed to operate with them. They take it quite seriously, and that reflects in the Kriegsmarine assessment I've mentioned a few times. Then you've got, I guess, Finland and Denmark. Finland's doing its best with what it has. They've obviously got a very big USSR-shaped problem to their east, which they're focusing on a lot. But their coastal defence doctrine mirrors the Swedes, but less so. The Danes probably have the real short end of the stick, because of course they have Germany to their immediate south, and they have a North Sea, a Baltic, and a Straits area of their coastlines to worry about, which it doesn't help. I mean, with the best will in the world, the best thing the Danish Navy could probably hope to do would be to close the straits between them and Sweden, and hope that doesn't tick off a bunch of neutral parties, and use their ships in fire support roles for their armies, which actually they did with relative degree of success in the wars with Prussia, even if they didn't win the overall conflict. Splendid dictator saying Norway did great with 19th century torpedoes against Blucher. Yes, but the fact that they were using 19th century torpedoes kind of tells you just how important everything was being taken there. Sapin Ninja saying it's 11 a.m. in New Zealand. Wow. Okay. Right. That's a bit of a time difference. 13 hours. Wow. Okay. Well, I guess someone has to be that far ahead of us. And then Graham W. So we've got two more here. Graham W. Kidd what asks, what is your secret to time management? Also, Mr. Clacking of Mrs. Drack's keyboard in the background. It's probably the Clacking of Mrs. Drack's keyboard in the background is still around, possibly. I think it may be in some elements of the main Drydock that was released earlier today. Albeit we have changed the layout of the room a little bit, so I think there's probably a little bit more material in between me and Mrs. Drack, which is probably shielding that a little bit. What's your secret to time management? To be honest, my secret to time management is just getting on and doing things. I've seen a huge number of people over the years, whether that be personally or professionally, get tied down in planning and scheduling and worrying about things, and they either spend so long planning to do a thing that they don't actually then end up having the time left to do the thing, or they talk themselves out of doing the thing. My attitude, I think, because I was basically my first 5 years of life, I was most of my waking hours were spent with my grandparents, because my grandparents were looking after me so that my parents could work. And of course, both of my grandparents are, World War II generation, were now World War II generation. And I basically got my time management and work ethic from them, which was basically either don't do it or just get on and do it. Because the more you think about it, the more that you'll end up finding reasons not to do it. So most of my time management consists of, admittedly, sometimes me just lying there going, I really don't want to do anything today. But at some point or another, I just go, okay, this is dumb. I'm doing something. And then I'll just keep going. Usually these days, until Mrs. Drack pulls me aside and says, you haven't eaten or drunk since like 9 o'clock this morning. It's now 10 p.m. at night. Here is some food. Here is some drink. You are consuming sustenance because you're too valuable to let go waste away. At which point, yes, dear. Okay, fine. Thank you. Yeah, that's one of these days I'll get an off-screen Mrs. Drack for a live stream, and you can ask her these kind of questions, like some of the stupid stuff she has to do to make sure I don't just fuse into my chair like some kind of imitation emperor on the golden throne and just start transmitting naval history 24/7. Yeah, I really miss my grandparents. They were awesome people. I mean, slight tangent, but it's worth it. My granddad, who passed away this year, aged 90, no, I keep saying this year, it's 2023. He passed away in the last year, aged 92. He, at age 85, most people age 85 have earned a well-deserved rest. But at age 85, we got a phone call from my nan, who had gone out, and she said, well, I've tried to call home to let your granddad know what I've picked up for dinner. He's not picking up the phone. Now, to be fair, granddad was never a particularly great fan of phones anyway. Real fan of computers, though. But, the fact that he hadn't picked up repeatedly was a bit unusual. And my nan, as she usually had gone out on her bike, it was going to take her about half an hour, 45 minutes to get home. She was a little bit worried. Granddad had a very major stroke about 5 years earlier. Still, that in and of itself is a whole story that just shows how resilient the guy was, because that stroke would have killed 95% of people who had it within 5 minutes. Not only did he live through it, the only visible effect of him recovering from it was he then had to walk with a stick sometimes. It didn't affect his mental state at all. But getting back to So getting back to this particular incident, my nan said, okay, look, you live 15 minutes away, 5 minutes by car. At that point we did, but just on the other side of the same town. Could you go and check in? Okay, off we go. Knock on the door. Grandad, you there? No, he's not there. Okay, that's weird. He wouldn't have got out. His car is still here. His bike is still here. He could have walked off to the shops, but given how long he's been out of communication, that would be worrying. So I was like, okay, if he's not in front, he's not in the house. Looked through the letterbox and I was lying on the floor. And then I thought, what if he's in his shed? Because as all good old British men do, he has a shed. Trust me, that shed is full of a lot of very interesting substances. Because he used to be a chemist, and he took home most of his chemistry lab when he retired. There's like a 2-pound lump of sodium sitting in there. We still haven't quite figured out how to safely move it yet, considering that the oil evaporated off about 10 years ago. Anyway, so I thought maybe he's in his shed. That would explain why he wasn't answering the phone and why he's not answering to anyone else. He's probably just happily working away at his woodworking. So I go down the side alley, and I look, I was like, Grandad, why are you 20 foot up in the air? And he looks at me and says, oh, hello, could you help me get down? And I was like, yes, I definitely will. Because you're an 85-year-old man, 20 foot up in the air, hanging off a rather rusty metal gutter. What on earth are you doing? Turns out, in his infinite wisdom, whilst completely alone, Grandad had decided to get out the world's biggest and heaviest wooden ladder and go up and clean the gutters on the second floor. No footing, no nothing, because that's incredibly safe. And the inevitable had happened. The ladder had slipped. The ladder had gone, catapulting itself off into the garden, leaving Grandad hanging from the gutter. So me, obviously in a bit of a panic, vaulting over the side gate, grabbing the ladder, manoeuvring the ladder, getting it under his feet, getting him down. He's like, thank you very much, my lad. Comes down. Grandad, how long have you been up there? I don't know. I heard the radio announce that it was 11 o'clock when, just before the ladder fell, and I'm looking at my watch going, are you telling me you've been hanging from that gutter for half an hour? I suppose I have. I haven't been going anywhere else. Okay. And at this point, this was at the point where I had been, I'd been rock climbing pretty constantly for about 2 or 3 years. And I was looking at him and thinking, Grandad, I'm in my mid to late 20s at this stage. I don't think I could have held on to a gutter for half an hour. How on earth did you manage that? And he's like, well, the only other choice was to fall. Which I was like, okay. Fair point. That doesn't actually answer the question, though. But that was Grandad. The bishop started saying at least he wasn't on the ladder when he fell. Well, he was. He had his feet on the ladder, and he was cleaning the gutters, and that's why when the ladder went down, he grabbed onto the gutter as he went down. I to this day, I still have no clue how he stayed up there. But I guess this is how his 3 older brothers, well, I've talked about our great uncles enough before, but yeah, he was just a remarkable guy. Anyway, the last super chat was Drac, how was the naval conference? Did you enjoy the Girl Scout cookies? Oh, that one I caught earlier, so yes. Okay, great. So that's the super chats for the moment. Graham W. Kid, strong guts though. Yeah, yeah. After another 7 years, I don't think the gutter would have lasted. That thing is rusted to heck and back. We need to replace it now. Right, okay. Sam Schultz says you should do a fun Friday with stories from your grandparents. Oh, I could do a fun Friday. I mean, there's a story from my grandmother that still makes me a little bit emotional about her witnessing what we now call Battle of Britain Day from the wonderful on fire area of Woolwich. There's all the various bits and pieces my granddad got up to during the war when he was a 12-year-old beating the Dad's army to down German bombers and all sorts of things. But yes, I will. I might do that at some point. I really should have gotten him on the channel before he passed away, but he was one of those guys who was just like, you don't ever think he will, so it doesn't seem quite so urgent. BR7 Class 747 asks, have you seen the Doctor Who Third Doctor story, The Sea Devils? It has a lot of Royal Navy stuff in it. I have not. I haven't seen a lot of really old classic era Doctor Who, to be perfectly honest. I've seen a little bit. I've mostly seen the revival, so Ninth Doctor onward. What have been the most over budget ships built? Probably stuff from the late 19th century when budget controls were a little bit less. But there's are ships that have gone over budget, and then there are ships that have cost twice as much as their original budget. Plus, obviously, cost estimation was a little less of a fine art back in the day. So Age of Sail and Ironclad era ships had a habit of going massively over budget in a way that really wasn't as possible with most Age of Steel ships. Hunter of Bats asks, how many 5.25-inch guns could Prince of Wales have had instead of the main guns? Not as many as you might imagine, actually. If you have a look at pre-war pictures of Utah, I think it is, when she's been converted to an AA training ship, and they've popped a 5-inch 38 mount in place of her original guns, you see that although it's obviously smaller, the amount of space it takes up isn't that much less. So, 5.25-inch twins, you could probably engineer... you could probably get maybe a triangular formation of 5.25s in place of the quads. But realistically, you're probably only going to, unless you massively expand the barbette or make it a platform, you're only going to get one in place of the twin. If you just stepped the superstructure somewhere, you could get two. So maybe that'd be, 6, 7... You get maybe 8 5.25-inch twins in place of the main battery if you were really stretching things. So yeah, by the way, we're now into primary chat questions. Cannon Fodder 43, if the 40mm pom-pom was very good, why did the Japanese Navy decide to replace it with a 25mm instead of upgrading them? Basically, they had the first version of the pom-pom. This is something that sometimes does get a bit confusing. There's, very broadly speaking, 3 generations of pom-pom, and you can probably make arguments for more than that, but roughly speaking, there's the first generation of 40mm pom-pom, which is a very early form. That's the one that the Japanese have in the early part of the interwar period. Then there's the later variant of the pom-pom, which is, in World War II terms, termed the low velocity version, which is kind of a 1930s-ish variant. And then you've got the high velocity version, which is the same 2-pounder as the low velocity version, just with different ammunition and slight changes to the gun and the mechanism. So you've basically got a kind of a subclass of the later interwar pom-pom, and it's a mixture of the low velocity and high velocity pom-poms that the British have, but the Japanese have the much older variant, and that older variant is by and large pretty much gone by World War II. Ramal says, channel related question, are you going to post videos about the 2023 US trip? Yes. So next month? Next month. So I've already started doing 2022 US trip stuff. That started with Constitution. We're currently up to North Carolina. Next month is Yorktown. The month after that is Iowa, then Midway, then Alabama, then Wisconsin. And starting next month, I'm also going to start putting up content from my 2022 Canada trip. So, Sackville, the Museum of the Atlantic, Haida, etc., etc. And then once we've gotten once we've gotten through those, then I will start putting up 2023 US trip content. Although I will probably fast line at least one of the 2023 US trip bits, which is Texas. I'll probably get that done sooner rather than later. But yeah, but more broadly speaking, the other 2023 US trip stuff will, at least for the stuff I've done so far, that will come out once I've done the 2022 trip stuff. And then, of course, there's other stuff that I'm going to be picking up this year in Australia and in September, which will basically mean that there'll be a continuity of overseas trip content, at least one video, possibly sometimes two per month, going forward for the foreseeable future. Fleet, if you can hear me, right at the beginning, I noticed a chap with the username David Cameron asking a question that got, I mean, there's no way I'm going to find it now, but since the poor chap has been asking a fair number of questions, and I think I've only ever answered 2 of his during the entire time of the channel, if you could pop back up and just see what the question was and pop it in via DM on Discord, that'd be great. The Legacy asks, was there ever a time since 1900 to today that a warship has intentionally rammed an opposing warship in battle? Yeah, there's been a few times, mostly with small stuff. Obviously the big stuff tends to have its decisions made long before, but there have been a few intentional rams on like destroyer scale. There's Glowworm versus Hipper, for example, and MTBs versus the S-boats. There was a lot of ramming going on in those various combats, because they tended to be at night and at very short range. Right, where are we going? Grego saying the first gen pom-pom couldn't have been worse than 25mm. Well, that's Japanese decision making for you. The thing is, the 25mm, albeit that it was already the losing weapon from a French anti-aircraft gun contest, on paper, and this is the big danger of paper specs versus performance in reality, on paper the 25mm had better performance than the first gen pom-pom, but the difference between what the paper statistics said and what actually happened, is a completely different matter. Captain C4 asks, if Nevada had been sunk in the channel at Pearl, assuming in the ideal position for the Japanese Navy, how much trouble would it have been for the US Navy in 1942, and how would the US Navy have solved the problem? Immediately speaking, it would have been quite difficult, because it would have made getting Enterprise in somewhat problematic. But more generally, the channel in that area, you can dredge around it to a certain degree, but also, as we saw in the Pearl Harbor salvage series, the US was fairly rapid at developing salvage tech. So given we saw in that video series what work they had to do on Nevada to get her refloated, they probably just would have done that but faster. So their main solution to the problem almost certainly would have just been, we'll salvage her, we'll prioritize her salvage, absolutely, first priority, drop everything else. And yeah, I mean, if they really wanted to, they could even have gone with ye oldie school medieval method of just slinging a bunch of ropes and chains around her, and sticking 2 of the less damaged or undamaged battleships on either side and just hauling her up, either with the tides or with motors or both, and moving her that way. I mean, it would wreck the hull considerably and make it much more difficult to repair her afterwards, but if they really needed the channel open, it could have been done. Sergeant Marcus Harris asks, if the entire French Navy joined for the Free French, how long would it take the British to finish Jean Bart? That's a difficult one. It depends on what they're gonna do with her, because if they got Jean Bart at the time of the fall of France, they're not going to get enough guns with her to actually finish her main battery. Well, and a bunch of other stuff. So I think a lot of it was going to depend on how they work it, because they're going to have to find some kind of alternate main armament for her, but what that alternate main armament is going to be is the question. I mean, the initial instinct would be, well, 15-inch guns, you know, take some of the spare 15-inch 42 gun barrels and rearm her with those, which might work. I mean, it would be a lot less of a kludge to try and make the shell hoists, etc., work with British 15-inch shells and charges than it would be to do some of the other ideas they had for Richelieu's, which was like rearming it using the guns from Lorraine or whatever. But I think it would depend greatly on how many of the French guns can they get, as well as the ship, and in the likely event that they can't get all 8, what do they choose to rearm her with? Where are they going to get the guns from? And how long does it take to improvise redoing all the shell hoists, etc., and magazine arrangements for it? Ramal asks, what if Halsey had the correct bearing and location of the Japanese fleet on December 7th, 1941? Would his carrier aircraft cause damage or even sink Japanese ships? Or would they be more by Japanese Combat Air Patrol or AAA? They have the potential to cause damage, but it's really a luck of the draw. Do they get a surprise attack in? It's possible, in which case they have more than enough capability to damage or sink some of the Japanese ships. But equally, you know, it's entirely possible that they get spotted and then annihilated by Combat Air Patrol. That's one of the most open what ifs. It could range from, you know, the Japanese lose a couple of carriers Midway style right at the start of the war, over to Enterprise just loses its entire air group for no purpose, and everything in between. Merle Lewis asks, are you familiar with or plan to visit LST 510-MV Cape Henlopen? I think someone mentioned LST 510 during this trip, but I'm not massively familiar with it or its location off the top of my head. 0 Kilo, did any other navies in World War II use identifiers such as the stripes on Regia Marina ships? The Nazis stuck swastikas on their ships in late 1940, early 1941, but then decided not to do that anymore for after a bit. In terms of major identifying stripe markings like that, I think that once the war gets seriously going, I think that's pretty much all. After that, it's kind of relying on visual identification without them because of the camouflage and aiming, bomb aiming point issues that they cause, which is why you get things like Sheffield being mistaken for Bismarck, for example. Bjarne Carlson asks, what's your take on the Danish-Austrian Battle of Heligoland? It's something I want to do a video on at some point. Probably in the... I'm probably going to do maybe a history of Heligoland Bight at some point, or history of Heligoland, but considering how small it is, I'm very strongly tempted to try and do that by actually going there, you know, prepare the script, but then actually go there and record it, and then go, you know, here's where the British tried to blow it up. And here's the bits that were added, and here's some of the original stuff, etc., etc. Wet Coaster says, are you going back to Haida? If I manage to get back to Canada at some point, yes. But considering my trip schedule's filling up quite rapidly, I don't know when that will be. Trying to keep up with... oh, there you go. Sean Riley asks, what could Surcouf have done in the Pacific? Stealth bombardment? Yeah, I mean, if she'd been around for long enough, towards the end of the war, shore bombardment definitely would have been something they'd get her. I mean, the US Navy would have loved to have Surcouf along for that, given that they were strapping rocket launchers and 5-inch guns, etc., to their ships to blow up trains and so forth. Having a ship that comes with, or a sub that comes with pre-built 8-inch guns in would be a dream come true. But in the earlier part of the war, she'd be too valuable an asset to risk for snap bombardments of Truk or Rabaul or things like that. I have a feeling that, as with a lot of the larger US subs, she might have been used for recon and supply missions more than at general patrol and attack missions. And she probably would have actually done fairly well as a sub that landed special forces, which was something that some of the larger US interwar subs were tasked to, because she has the additional advantage of, if anything goes wrong for them on the beach, or they're being chased off or something like that, a couple of 8-inch guns is a fairly good go away signal to other forces that might be attacking the special forces that she's landed. Peter Alexander McGowan, favourite Battlefleet Gothic faction? That's a difficult one. It used to be a kind of a three-way tie between Eldar, Space Marines, and Imperial Navy. No, it's not Eldar. Orcs, Imperial Navy, and Space Marines. Orcs because of the hilarious randomness of it. The Space Marines because the Space Marine ships were really tough. I really liked strike cruisers. Running around with the strike cruisers that just refuse to die is hilarious fun. But my biggest fleet is the Imperial Navy. There's Imperial Navy ships floating around all over here. I love torpedo salvos of death. I even had my own custom Gloriana class made, which I may or may not have shown in a previous video. I'm tentatively hopeful about the possibility of Battlefleet Gothic coming back mainstream, but I have plenty of STLs from places like Soulforge Studio anyway, and I really hope they get to complete their Gloriana series before any potential issues come up with Games Workshop relaunching the thing. Although, if Games Workshop wants to relaunch it and do their own Glorianas, then we can compare and contrast and see who does it better. John Ashley Smith said, did you visit the Canadian Submariner Museum in Port Burwell, Ontario when you were here last year? I don't believe so. No, I don't think we did. Derek Heeb, when is Drac coming to Puget Sound? Good question. Don't know. As I said, what I do know is that my September schedule at the moment notionally has penciled in something like a week in San Francisco for Hornet and the apparent plethora of other museum ships that they have there. I know I'll be going to Chicago to see U-505. I know that I'll be going to Buffalo to see the Sullivans and Little Rock and the sub they've got there. I know I'll be going to COD. I know I'll be going to Slater. I'm hoping to try and then also get down to Laffey, which is a bit further down. I'll definitely be flying down to that. And then it's kind of filling in around those areas at the moment. But it depends. It's very dependent on what I can manage with flights and distances and so on and so forth. Peter Smith, would you ever consider doing a video on the Yangtze incident? Yeah. Yeah, I think it is actually on my list of Wednesday videos to do, albeit somewhat further down. Grey Ghost, if you had to build a space navy for Earth right away, what World War II guns would you use for battleships, cruisers, frigates and destroyers, and would they be in turrets or casemates, hand waving that we have FTL? I mean, if I was building a space navy for Earth right away, I wouldn't use World War II guns. Apart from anything, you know, gun that you need to change the propellant for one thing. Also, the recoil in space would be interesting, to say the least. I mean, you know, okay, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, but chemical weapons, chemical propellants in space, not the wisest of things, I think. I would prefer to use almost anything but. Helium Road saying there are videos of Soviet warships ramming US Navy ships in the 1980s. Yeah, that's a bit outside the channel, though. AJ Drucken asks, how did warships attain the classification of sloop of war in the 19th century? By being a sloop and commissioned into the Navy. They had a whole range of designations. Obviously, frigates were 5th rates and 6th rates and the occasional 4th rate, but then you had brigs, sloops, brig sloops, gun brigs, corvettes, cutters, etc., etc. And yeah, to be a sloop of war was basically, is your ship type a sloop? Yes. Are you commissioned into the Navy on a temporary or permanent basis? Yes. Well, congratulations. You are now a sloop of war. Have fun. Fleet saying, sorry, Jack, can't get back far enough in the chat. That's frustrating. Hopefully he's still around. Then he can ask a question in here. Reading Railroad Fan asks, what was the aft superstructure on the Northamptons used for? It looks like a float plane control tower. Well, there would have been a hangar for aircraft, secondary spotting, for range finding position, accommodation, that kind of thing. That's generally what you find in the superstructures anyway, and especially aft. Let's have a quick look at the Northamptons. See if there's anything that really stands out. Northampton class cruiser. Oh yeah, that's a rangefinder. Yeah, at least I'm looking at the photo from of a 1941. Yeah, on that aft superstructure, on the what's actually technically the main mast up top, that's a fairly standard US Navy rangefinder control station on a tripod mast with spotting platform and what looks like somebody strapped some light anti-aircraft weapons up there as well, for good measure. John Ashley Smith says, kicking myself for saying a complete Eldar fleet, including a Voidstalker battleship. Felt I didn't have an Eldar paint job in me. Yeah, the Eldar are a little bit of a difficult one to pull off correctly, admittedly. And to be fair, the Voidstalker was an absolute pig to build. It's this fucking great, complicated, incredibly heavy white metal thing. The good news is you can now get a STL that's set for the Eldar, which is, you know, 95% what the originals are. And then you can get a 3D printed Voidstalker that doesn't weigh as much as a small child. Fog Battleship Warspite. Your thoughts on US Navy armoured cruisers and how good they were compared to their UK counterparts? It depends on exactly which armoured cruisers. The last two that they have are pretty good representations of the armoured cruiser type. Their main problem is the 10-inch guns. So in a gunfight, last generation armoured cruisers, I'd give the British armoured cruisers the benefit, because although they don't quite have 10-inch guns, they do have 9.2 inch and 7.5 inch. The fact is the rate of fire is going to be significantly greater, and neither side is really capable of rejecting the other side's main shells at most reasonable combat ranges. So yeah, the last gen US armored cruisers, propulsion, propulsion and protection wise, are pretty decent. Most of their firepower is pretty decent. I just think they slightly misstepped with the 10-inch there. But there you go. Well, there's not that many US armored cruisers. There you go. New US Navy Institute Press. US Armoured Cruisers, Design and Operational History. So, yeah, New York, Brooklyn, Pennsylvania, Tennessee. Well, we've covered the Pennsylvania and Tennessee. So, let's have a quick look over at, yes, we've got New York. Let's have a quick reminder of New York. New York's not too bad. Little bit on the small side, but she's pretty decent. Brooklyn, yeah, for their time period, New York and Brooklyn are pretty competitive. As I say, a little bit on the small side compared to some armored cruisers. I think if they'd done the Pennsylvanias and Tennessees with 8-inch guns in there on their fore and aft turrets instead of 10-inch, then they probably would have actually been, full on competitive for the top spot, but they didn't. So. James Bentley asks, why didn't Yamamoto, as a brilliant naval strategist, deploy his subs as in Wolfpack against Allied supply lines? Because Japanese battle doctrine mainly called for the subs to be used against warships, and there's only, well, he in part wrote that doctrine, and B, Allied supply lines are a little bit harder to hit in the Western Pacific, because thanks to the initial Japanese advance, there aren't that many Allied supply lines in the immediate vicinity, and two, the Pacific is really, really, really big, and unlike the Atlantic, where Britain is a fairly small target for incoming convoys, and so predicting convoy routes is relatively easy, there's fewer supply convoys in the Pacific, and they have a lot more freedom about where to go, because their destination is usually Australia, which is just a fraction large. They've got multiple different routes they can go to get there, or numerous islands, and you don't know which particular island they may be going to in any one time. Vicky asks, what happens if Shikaku founders from battle damage on the way back from Coral Sea, like she nearly did historically? Well, that's going to make the battle for Guadalcanal interesting if you've only got Zuikaku available. If you've only got Zuikaku available, then, especially after Midway, I mean, the Japanese are still going to have to throw something into the breach to try and deal with the US, but it's very possible then that Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz are going to go much more the US's way than they historically did, which will be very handy for the US and might actually see Zuikaku sunk during the Guadalcanal campaign, at which stage, once Taiho goes the way of the Dodo shortly thereafter, the Japanese aren't going to have any original flavour fleet carriers left. They're just going to have Junyo and Hio, assuming that they're still around and they don't get thrown in, So yeah, Junyo and Hio would, after the demise of Taiho, would be the biggest things, the biggest flight decks the Japanese have afloat until the Yunryus show up. Which would probably, I mean, on the one hand, it would make the US Navy's lives a lot easier, not having to worry about... Actually, yeah, that's a good point. If they don't have to worry about them, then you might not even get something like the Battle of Cape Engano. Because if the Japanese don't have any fleet carriers to throw at the US landing forces, then why would Halsey bother going after a handful of, pint-sized conversions? So you might then get the great battle with Center Force. Yeah, that's a lot of butterflies coming out from that. Good question. Graham W. Kidd saying the Jean Bart question comes up often. They probably need to get on the FAQ. Yeah, I will probably maybe quarterly do an FAQ video. I do have enough questions for another FAQ video, but I want to make sure that the FAQs are not so frequent people think of them as the second helping of the Drydock, and they do have to be properly frequently asked questions. Nanya Bidness asks, if the revolutionary US Navy was bolstered with softwood ships, like the Great Lakes Fleet, would it have provided any sort of deterrent to British reinforcements? Not really, because the US Revolutionary War era fleet, the Continental Fleet, is not that big. And at that stage, the British are actually showing up with full fleets. So their the escort to British reinforcements would easily blow past any US Navy attempt to stop them, whether that be what the Continental Navy had historically, or including a bunch of extra softwood, greenwood ships. That's assuming the Revolutionary era US can find the sailors to man them and the money to pay them, which is going to be another interesting problem. But that's why you get things like the Battle of Virginia Capes against an entire French fleet, with full-on, like, couple of dozen ships of the line kind of event. Those are repeat questions. Jake, as a fleet, if at some point you can go back after the stream and grab David Cameron's question or questions and DM them to me, that'd be great, because then, as I said, I'm probably going to have to do another live stream next week for February's Patreon Drydock questions, so I can answer those then, which hopefully he'll help. Primark 359, what is the shell on the shelf? This is a deactivated GAU 8 30mm round. Which is quite hilarious because, I mean, obviously it's very heavy, but because it's deactivated and empty, this is obviously a very light empty cartridge, so its point of balance is like here. Where is it then? Yeah, that's the point of balance, roughly speaking. I got given that ages ago. I think it was like I think it was in my teens when someone gave me that. It's been hanging around ever since. Good paperweight. Grego saying, could arm the unfinished French battleship with two of the King George V's quad turrets be easier than the 15-inch 42s? Problem is, if you replace the entire turret, then you're also replacing all the hoist mechanisms. The main reason I said maybe rearm with 1542s is that, okay, the shell size, the shell weight and the shell shape is going to be slightly different, but you could, in theory, with with very slight modifications, probably make the existing shell hoist systems, etc., compatible with a 15-inch 42 shell. If you slap in a complete turret with British 14-inch guns, you're going to have to rip out the interior of the barbettes and drop in an entire shell and magazine handling and hoist system, which is just going to take forever. Ooh. Sorry, the questions just skipped. So there we go. I think I've got back to where I was. Splendid Dictator, can you explain why the Japanese developed the special AA shell for their battleships versus why the US didn't? Leaving the Type 3 Sanshiki. Basically, the Japanese were just interested in getting as much anti-aircraft firepower in the air as possible. I think they knew with things like their 5-inch guns that they weren't, although they were technically dual purpose, they weren't really making it quite as good as they had hoped. And they also, remember, had modified, say, the Congo's guns and a bunch of their other battleship guns for fairly high elevations. And they knew they were going to come under a fair bit of air attack, so why not at that stage? Whereas for the US, well, let's face it, the Type 3 wasn't actually that successful as an anti-aircraft shell, and various navies had looked at battleship gun-sized anti-aircraft shells, and they'd mostly come to the conclusion that it was far more trouble than it was worth. And I think the US Navy was in agreement with that, and by the time they're actually deploying battleships onto the front lines in large numbers, you've got a bunch of 5-inch 38 guns and a bunch of 20mm and 40mm, and B, you also have, post mid-1943, more than enough fighters up there that the extra hassle of battleship AA shells isn't really worth it, especially when you consider that if you're going to be firing battleship AA shells, then all of the anti-aircraft 40mm and 20mm positions that you have fore and aft have to be evacuated so you don't kill them. Michael Kovacic maybe asks, can Hipper defeat BT in August 1916 when the first scouting group had been reinforced with Bayern and 2 Koenigs? Also, which ship flew Hipper's flag? I think none of the 3 battleships were fitted as flagships. This August 1916. This is the when they redeployed. I can't recall off the top of my head which one had Hipper's flag. I know I've got a book somewhere that will tell me. Could they have defeated BT in August 1916? I think it depends on whether or not 5th Battle Squadron is still with him. Because the remnants of 1st Scouting Group's battle cruisers plus a Bayern and 2 Koenigs, assuming that BT actually, engages, because at that point he has a speed advantage, he can just leave. He's faster than the Koenigs. Faster than Bayern as well, for that matter. But assuming you end up in some kind of unescapable gun action, then yes, the Hipper can defeat BT's battle cruisers, but if 5th Battle Squadron is still with him, Warspite has basically been swapped out for Queen Elizabeth. Malaya's probably still getting patched up a bit, but with 3 or 4 Queen Elizabeths there, the firepower advantage would still be with BT. Joseph Nielsen, would it have been feasible for the US to just scrap all the standards after Pearl Harbor and put everything into new build fast battleships? You could have done from a purely technical perspective, it would have been possible, but recycling that steel, because the steel shortage was what paid the Montanas and also held up Kentucky and Illinois. Although you would have had some steel from those ships to recycle, it's not quite as easy as that. And you've also got, machinery, etc. I suppose you could reuse the guns if the guns were the problem, if manufacturing guns were a problem. But if you're going to scrap all of the standards, politically that's going to be really difficult, because for a while the standards were patrolling up and down the US coast convincing everyone that they were going to protect the West Coast from a Japanese invasion. So politically it would have been a bit of a hot potato, but also considering all the various second line roles, shore bombardment roles, etc., I don't think the US could have built enough fast battleships to make up for the loss of all of the standards all at once. Sean Eldridge asks, how many British carrier groups were in the South Pacific during World War II? Well, depends how you define a carrier group. Broadly, the British Pacific Fleet stuck together as one whole unit, but I mean, you've got the British Pacific Fleet, but that includes, by the end of the war, that includes fleet carriers, some of the new light carriers, the light fleet carriers, and it includes a bunch of escort carriers. So they're not all operating in just one big blob of aircraft carriers. They do have them separated out into specific, I guess you'd call them task forces. But I don't know exactly how you want to define it. So the British didn't have like, okay, well, here we have one fleet with a bunch of carriers, and here we have another fleet with a bunch of carriers, and they're doing something different. It was just, here's the British Pacific Fleet. They're helping with Okinawa, for instance. But within that, you might have several distinct groupings for organisationally of different types of carrier. Alex Lamb, if the London Naval Treaty increases cruiser tonnage by 30,000 tonnes, as the Admiralty, would you build 4 additional Leanders, 2 9.2-inch cruisers, or do you do some fudging, refit Tiger and claim that she's a cruiser? If it's London, the first London, I'm probably just going to build 4 Leanders, because at that point the Admiralty desperately wants more cruisers. Refitting and claiming Tiger as a cruiser is not really going to work, because the cruisers do have that 10,000 ton limit, and unless you fill Tiger with helium balloons, she's not displacing 10,000 tons only anytime soon. And a pair of 9.2-inch, yeah, I don't think the pair of 9.2-inch, well, one, the 9.2-inch designs don't really exist in 1930, so yeah, 4 additional Leanders, or maybe a couple more or maybe 3 more counties would probably be the goal. Wet Coaster asks, going to Portsmouth for a day in June, besides Victory, what is a must see? If you're going for a day, it depends what you are mainly interested in. If you want to tour ships and their artifacts, then either Victory and Warrior, or Victory and Mary Rose, or Victory, Warrior and Mary Rose, depending on when you get there and how fit and healthy you're feeling. If you are interested perhaps more in artifact exhibits than the ships themselves, then maybe getting on the internal ferry over to Gosport and checking out the Museum of Naval Firepower and Mary Rose on top of Victory would be better, because Warrior is a brilliant place to visit, but it's a ship in situ, whereas if you want to look at lots of individual things, then the other two would be better for that. I'd offer to give you a tour around the ships, but if it's June, I will probably be in Australia. Chameleon says you should do a how to build a ship video, an explanation of the process and supply chain of production. I could do. In fact, if I was going to do that, I know exactly which ship I would do it on. I would do it on the 74 gun ship of the line, because I have that massive, like, 4-volume set on the 74 gun ship of the line. But that would be more of a mini series than a single video. Captain Seafort says, history of Heligoland, how many parts of that will that series be? If I'm going out there, I'd probably try and do it in one large video, maybe an hour and a half video, but it would kind of be an abbreviated history. If I don't get to go out there, then it might be split into like 2 or 3. Nosdormu 89 says, considering World of Warships covers the very late 1800s to 1960-ish, I'm curious, are there any games like World of Warships that cover the Age of Sail, Ironclad, and pre-Dreadnought eras? Oh, ow. That hurt. Not exactly like World of Warships. There's Ultimate Admiral Age of Sail, which isn't World of Warships like, but as the name suggests, does cover the Age of Sail. Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts does cover the pre-Dreadnought era quite comprehensively. There are games out there that do cover ironclads, but they are not like World of Warships at all. Great Ghost News says Nautilus visit maybe in September, since I missed it this time. Felix TL, have you ever considered visiting the Oscarborg Fortress where Blucher was sunk? Yes, that's another one of these videos I want to do on site, because I've noticed in the past year or two a lot of channels have covered the Battle of Drydock Sound, and so in order to offer something a little bit new, a little bit different, I've said to myself, you know, if I am going to do the Battle of Drydock Sound, I want to go in an April, hopefully when there's a bit of fog like there was on the day, work with the Oscarborg Fortress Museum and not recreate the entire event because I don't want to be blown up, but I want to take a boat basically from the entrance of Oslo Fjord up the fjord so that you can get an idea of what the approach would have been like for the Germans, and also then obviously either have some filming done or then go ashore and do some filming on Oscarborg, so you also get the Norwegian perspective, so you can actually see exactly what it would have been like. I mean, barring obviously all the modern developments that have occurred in the area. Okay, it's 11 o'clock, so we've probably got maybe 15 minutes to half an hour before I probably should go to sleep. So I'm going to try and catch up a little bit on the questions. Apologies for the slowness, but I can only answer so quickly. Robert Flores says, I'm working on a World War II Pacific War game. An interesting issue is the damage a carrier can take and still be combat effective. If damage occurs in certain ways, what might this non-critical damage look like? It depends. Carriers are very fragile when it comes to flight ops, but once a carrier has launched its first major airstrike, for example, damage to the flight deck right up at the bow is probably non-critical, because once you have a mostly clear flight deck, damage right up at the bow isn't going to affect your ability to recover aircraft, and if you're not fully deck loading a strike, you can probably get aircraft airborne before the hole in the bow if you've taken a hit right up front. Obviously you don't want it to go too deep, because then you're going to have flooding, and then you're going to have problems with maintaining your speed and so forth. I mean, the thing is, yeah, if you take a direct hit, there's splash damage and splinter damage, which may not be particularly too critical, but if you're taking direct hits, then I suppose the other thing that might not be too critical is basically hitting on the extremities, because aircraft can land slightly forward of a hit that's right aft and take off slightly forward of a hit that's right forward if the flight deck is otherwise clear. I mean, you could, I suppose, hit the island, but if you wipe out basically the air traffic control crew, or you put a hole in the funnel, that's going to affect the ship's speed or the ship's ability to handle aircraft, which would be a bit of a problem. You could have at least, if you're talking about lighter bomb hits like 250 or 500 pounders, hits to the edges of the flight deck that mainly affect the ship's anti-aircraft battery would probably not massively affect its ability to continue combat. in terms of taking off and launching aircraft. You basically, for critical damage, you're looking at, has it compromised the ship's speed, i.e. have you hit the engines, or have you punctured the funnel trunking? Is it affecting the ship's ability to operate aircraft from or command the ship from a human perspective, i.e. have you blown up the forward part of the island, or have you put a hole in the flight deck somewhere that is, you know, within sort of part closer to the center than, say, the last 30 feet of the flight deck in either direction, and the last 10 foot on either side. That sort of core area where if there's a hole, this is going to be a major problem to run aircraft ops. And of course, you know, what's the bomb done? Has it exploded on the flight deck, or has it gone down in the hangar and wrecked a bunch of stuff in the hangar? Donald Irons, can you do Visio on HMS Strahala? I can add her to the list if she's a pre-1950 boat. Gingerfest says, if a sub is a boat and a cruiser is a ship, what is a cruiser sub? Probably still a boat. Daniel Debelcourt, any future plans to visit U505 in Chicago? Ideally this September, if I can. Bishop Styles pointing out gunpowder brings its own oxygen. Yeah, I still wouldn't want to use gunpowder in space, though. Jeffrey Violette, in your USS Marblehead video, 3 of the dead listed at the end of the video are Chinese names. Assuming these are Chinese nationals, how common was it in the US Navy to employ foreign nationals? In the Asiatic fleet, very common. They basically were cooks, cabin stewards for the officers, laundry, that kind of thing. And that was actually very common in a lot of different navies. It's one of the places where the Chinese immigrant community in the UK actually got started, was Chinese nationals and Filipino, not so much Filipino nationals in the British Navy, but definitely a lot of Chinese nationals and people from that general area serving on Royal Navy ships and then later settling in the UK. Obviously, it's slightly less common on, say, a ship that's in the Atlantic Fleet, but in the Asiatic fleet particularly, and in, thank you Bob Fry, and for the Iron Brew Replenishment Fund, and in the Pacific fleet to a certain extent, it was actually pretty common. Fushi Smith asks, what kind of ship is the Flying Dutchman and the Black Pearl? They kind of look like galleons to me. They're very weird from trying to classify as an actual ship classification. The Black Pearl is, as much as you can make any sense of it, is relatively clearly an older style of merchant vessel, especially when you get some of the backstory later on in the 3rd movie, I think it is. Because you've got to bear in mind, although she's like considerably more built up than a period warship in terms of superstructure, she's also not that, she's in the size-wise, she's in the range of the Interceptor, and has magical exploding cannonballs, but that's another matter entirely. The Dutchman is also a throwback to an older design style, although massively embellished, because she's now the flagship of Davy Jones and got all sorts of supernatural things going on. But the Flying Dutchman kind of, to me, looks like a cross between a race-built galleon and a Dutch flute, from which are kind of both 16th, early 17th century ships. AJ Drucken, have you thought about doing a series on Confederate raiders and their influence on international arbitration? So I've done a video on CSS Alabama, I suppose I could do one on CSS Florida, maybe. Um, doing one on Confederate raiders generally might also be a thing instead of trying to pick up specific ones. Now I've done Alabama. The influence on international arbitration is interesting, but a little outside the scope of the channel. So I'd mention it, but to be honest, international politics doesn't really interest me all that much. Stephen Meyer, if you could send any of your videos back into 1930, which would they be? I think the surviving the sinking ship video list the disasters but not the causes could help save lives and send navies into a panic. Yeah, or the damage control video. Damage control, anti-aircraft, what's the best anti-aircraft guns? Those would probably be good ones. Anything that mentions Yamato's actual true size and displacement. Thanks, BR Class 47. Hope you have a good day or night, whatever the relevant case may be. Good Crusader, what do you know about beer rations in the Navy? About the modern Navy, not a tremendous amount. In terms of the Navy and the time the channel covers, in the main portion of the time the channel covers, beer is kind of what you get if they can't find enough rum. If you go far enough back into kind of Francis Drake-ish period, Tudor, early Stuart, then there is beer, because at that point that's rum isn't being issued because they haven't got it yet. Beer is quite common as a ration, but there's all sorts of complaints about, you know, it being too watered down, it not being brewed properly, etc. So and so on. Obviously, it's issued in slightly greater amounts than the rum is, because you don't have to water it down, although it appears people did, and that's what caused a lot of issues. Farrell Lyon asks, I'm a former US Navy gunner's mate from the 90s brush war decade. In gun school, every weapon system was referred to as a mount. Was there a difference between a turret and a mount? This is something that people argue over occasionally, but usually the definition between a turret and a mount is that a turret has meaningful armor protection and a mount does not. So a mount might have splinter protection, for example, but that does not make it a turret. Whereas a turret is usually accepted to have kind of, I think the rule of thumb, if I remember correctly from at least one book, was that a turret should be able to protect against an impact from a shell similar to that which the turret fires. But that's not strictly a requirement, because we acknowledged, for example, that the Japanese 8-inch guns are the Japanese 8-inch gun mountings on their heavy cruisers, we call them turrets, but they only have an inch of armor. That's not going to stop an 8-inch shell, but we tend to call them turrets. But an inch of armor, although it's barely above splinterproof, it is above splinterproof. I think usually the other requirement is a turret has to be fully enclosed, and that does bring up some discussion when you get to things like the 5-inch 38s, because they are fully enclosed and they do have a degree of protection. They're not purely splinterproof, but technically speaking, most of the time they're called 5-inch 38 guns mounts, as opposed to the 14 or 16-inch guns which are in turrets. Okay, that's another skip. Mr. Big asks, why did HMS Nelson not attend the hunt for Bismarck? She was too far away. And did Rodney get a torpedo hit on Bismarck? I believe so. I don't think there's particular reason to doubt it. Rodney fired enough torpedoes. The impact of a torpedo is very different from the impact of a shell. At least some of Bismarck's crew reported they did get hit. Rodney's crew definitely thought they got a hit. The hydrophones on Rodney thought they heard the correct explosion. and the bit of Bismarck that would have shown the damage of the hit is now buried under a bunch of silt and smashed almost flat, so it's going to be very difficult to work out one way or the other, but balance of probabilities, yes. So we're coming up to 7:15, so I'm just going to accept this skip and see what this supplies. Grego says Black Pearl is fast and Merchantmen weren't. Blockade runners were. Also, Black Pearl, by the time she's that fast, is blessed with supernatural powers. So there's that. Oh wow, this is going quite quickly. Chris Southgate suggesting CSS Shanoad. Okay, that's an interesting raider to add to the list. Grey Ghost, unfortunately in June I will probably be in Australia, which is probably about as far away from Reading Airport as is humanly possible. Graham W. Kidd, is any butterfly that doesn't slow down the Manhattan Project going to lengthen the war, given that the atomic bombs finished the war? Yes, enough. The correct amount of butterflies will do that. Basically, it comes down to, is the butterfly enough that at the time the atomic bombs are ready for deployment, that you can't actually feasibly get into range of Japanese cities with your B-29s safely. So if the US is still, several islands back and still trying to, knock off Okinawa and Saipan, etc., etc., then at that point, the development of the atomic bombs isn't necessarily going to end the war immediately, because the atomic bombs will probably be deployed on those islands, not on mainland Japan. Well, they will be deployed on mainland Japan eventually, but it will take time to, nuke the islands, move in, try not to die of fallout, and then re-establish bases, and then go after the Japanese home islands. So yeah, if you extend the war long enough, you can. If you drag out the initial parts of the war long enough and reduce the US rate of advance enough, you can make the war last longer, but not too much longer. You're talking about reduction, an increase in the war of months. You missed the Drop Bears super chat. What's the Drop Bears super chat? Mason Stewart, what battle operation do you want to see made into a movie? For me, it's Jutland. Sad to see that Ben Kingsley's Jutland movie isn't happening. Jutland or Samar, they're my top two. I would say, definitely. Jutland would need to be an absolute big budget movie because of the sheer number of ships involved. The fact that there's so many different ships. There's so much going on as well. Samar would still need to be a big-ish budget movie, but in the grand scale of Hollywood, you could probably do Samar on a mid-scale budget, as opposed to the all-singing, all-dancing budget you'd need for Jutland. But though, yeah, those would be my top two, and then Trafalgar in a close third. Mr. Big says, was there ever talk in Britain about renovating Nelson and Rodney? And if so, what would that have looked like? Not Rodney. She was pretty worn out by the end of the war. In Churchill's writings, there was some talk about modernising Nelson and some outline of what that might have looked like, but there was never there's not like a big book of modernised Nelson plans that you can refer to. So kind of like with the refit of Hood, we have some indications what it might have looked like, but nothing absolutely concrete. Alex Lamb, why was the US so behind in cruiser numbers in the 1910s and 20s? Well, I do understand money is tight, but surely someone would notice and have said something about it. The US Navy was saying something about it quite often. Congress, however, was saying, no, this is the amount of money we're giving you, and if you keep complaining enough about it, we'll give you less. So, I mean, this is why you sometimes see people going on about, when people ask about why didn't the US build battle cruisers, you get some people who say, oh, battle cruisers didn't fit the US battle doctrine, or people say, oh, the US recognized at the beginning that battle cruisers were a terrible idea, and things like that. It's all complete nonsense. The US Navy wanted battle cruisers. They liked the idea of battle cruisers. Fair enough, their idea of battle cruisers was not exactly the same as the British idea or the German idea, but then no one's idea of battle cruisers was exactly the same as anyone else's. But the US Navy was determined to try and get battle cruisers if they could afford it, but they saw, remember at the time this is World War One, so pre-carrier, the battleship is the arbiter of naval power. If the battleship is the arbiter of naval power, and it's also the longest build item, then that is the thing in the event of a shrinking budget that you absolutely have to prioritize at all times. And that's why they keep building battleships at the expense of almost anything else. Because if you don't have the cruisers are quite expensive, so if you have to cut cruisers to pay for the battleships, well, so be it. But also cruisers to a certain extent and destroyers to a very great extent can be built a lot faster than battleships. So if there's a ramp up in tension and an accompanying ramp up in budgets, you can probably at least get some cruisers into the water and a lot of destroyers into the water, either by the time hostilities start or shortly thereafter. You can't significantly increase your battleship strength with a few years' notice, just because, as I said, with the build times. And similarly with battle cruisers, the US was designing battle cruisers and asking for battle cruisers almost since the moment Invincible hit the water. It's just until the Lexingtons they didn't have the money for it. Okay, so it's 23:20. So I'm going to do maybe half a dozen more questions and then wrap this one up. We've been going for just over 3 hours, so I think that's fairly good. And I do need some sleep. Back to the grindstone tomorrow, making videos. Bradley Willman, what was it like to fire the 5-inch 38 on the New Jersey? It had to be amazing. I was standing right next to you when Ryan asked you if you wanted to fire it. Yes. Was I ever going to say no to something like that? It's really cool. As the rather wonderful gentleman who was actually helping with the firing pin, firing trigger mentioned, it's like, once you fired it, if you, and you guys probably heard it even probably more than me, when you raise the earmuff, you can hear the explosion echoing back and forth. I mean, a good chunk of me was going, I wonder what it would be like to take the ear protection off this close and listen to it fire, considering that the charge is considerably less than the actual charge they used in wartime. But then the other part of me was going, well, they're the professionals who run the ship, so if they say wear this ear protection, I should probably wear the ear protection. I do value my hearing to a certain degree, and yeah, being an engineer, I'm more aware than most that standing next to loud explosions is probably a very good way of losing parts of your hearing quite often. Hugh Rody saying, Hugh from Tin Can Sailors here. Hello! That was an absolutely wonderful morning I spent with you guys at Tin Can Sailors. I definitely want to return, and as soon as I've roughed out my September schedule a little bit more, I'm really hoping I'll be able to include a revisit For those of you who aren't aware, the Tin Can Sailors, as the name suggests, is an organisation that supports the memory and organisation and legacy of people who have served in the tin cans, the frigates and destroyers and so forth. They're an absolutely wonderful bunch of people, and they have an absolutely brilliant library and archive. I mean, where else can you hear from someone who actually saw Texas fire in anger? You know, that's not the kind of experience you get every day, let alone a lot of the other stuff that those guys have done. I really, really want to come back and visit them again. Bradley Willman, did you get a chance to look through the Pearl Harbor book I gave you, and what do you think about the naval photos I lent you to scan for your collection? If I'm remembering the right book, I'm part way through it. The photos are actually just over there, awaiting scanning. Mrs. Drack is in charge of scanning at the moment, while I desperately try and catch up on video content after having been away. So I will let you know about the naval photos ASAP. Once Mrs. Drack has done the scans. But thank you very much both for the book and for the lending of the photos. I was actually earlier today, I was actually reorganizing some of the shelves slightly to fit in some of the books, not just that people have sent me generally, but also some of the books specifically that I picked up or was given in while I was in the US this time, including a really, really good find, Knight's Modern Seamanship, revised edition, 11th edition, 1945. Some extracts from this are going to be showing up in when I eventually do my paper and follow-up video to my Destruction of HMS Hood video, with even more evidence to put in. Yeah, the people out there who are just like, there is no trough when a battlecruiser is moving at high speed, and a ship turns instantly when you put the rudder over. Sorry. I mean, apart from physics saying no, that's a bunch of nonsense. Yeah, Night Seamanship also says no. It has a whole bunch of particularly interesting diagrams to go with it. So, yeah, I was really overjoyed to see that, because it's one thing to be arguing... I know, it's one thing to be arguing basic physics and actual reality with people when you're an engineer and you know these things, and it's just depressing that people refuse to acknowledge them. But when you've got something of the caliber of Night Seamanship to just go, yeah, there it is in black and white. Please stop. That's a whole other level on top of that. Aluminium fence? I don't know what is an A465. I have no idea what an A465 is. It's not an Airbus. It's not a particular road in the area that I'm particularly aware of. So, yeah. Charles Dance as Jellicoe. Oh, I would pay very good money for that. Splendid dictated the unicorn ringing bell. Yes, about that. I may have also rung Salem's bell while being directly under Salem's bell, and then immediately regretted that. And then thought that was funny, I should do it again and this time capture it on film. I'm not necessarily always particularly smart. You already think you're welcome back every time. Thank you very much. I will obviously let people know in advance on my way back. Aluminium fence. Where did you get the iron brew on USS New Jersey? Someone actually very kindly gave it to me right at the beginning of the trip, and that it was actually pretty much the perfect amount. I finished the last can while I was waiting in the security line at Baltimore Airport before heading over, and obviously they wouldn't have let me take it through, so that was absolutely... I was kept in iron brew my entire time on the East Coast. Tavildo says it's the Heads of the Valleys Road in Wales. Oh, okay. I guess I'll have to go. I may have gone over it at some point in my life, but haven't been there. Haven't been in that area of Wales for a while. Animal 16365 says, "How does it feel to reach your channel, reach over 400k?" It's a good feeling. I was very amused when it reached two milestones immediately after that. One, which I knew the American audience would appreciate when it reached 401k, and the internet audience would appreciate when it reached 404k, and now it's just a bit over. So yeah, it's nice to watch the channel grow. I mean, the thing is, you know, the more the channel grows, the more I can do. You know, back in 2020, I was trying to compact an entire US trip into 2 weeks, partly because I had to deal with annual leave from work, and partly because it was going to cost a lot of money. So the less time I spent out abroad, the less money it would cost. To the point that I think I only had like maybe 1 or 2 hotel stays in the entire thing. The rest of the time was going to be, the nights were going to be spent on coaches or planes to save money. And then, of course, last year I did Canada and the US. And this year I'm going to be in the US a total of 3 times. Obviously, the one just gone. Then in about a month, I'll be back in San Diego for the Society for Military History conference, the SMH conference, because I'm on a panel there. And then in September, as I said, I'm going back to the States for the HINSA conference. Hopefully the McMullen conference as well, if they accept my paper, and visiting a bunch of ships, as I've already mentioned, and other places. And then in June, Australia, although, as I've also mentioned near the top of the stream, that is, you know, a little, all 4 visits between them is a little bit beyond my capabilities. So yeah, I'll be working with the same crew of guys that went over to Canada. So we are working on getting some kind of crowdfunding going to help with defray the costs of the Australia trip, because it is also going to be the biggest, most expensive trip I've ever done, because yeah, getting to the States and getting to Australia, you know, I think I spent less on this trip to the States on all transport, flights there and back, internal flights, car hire, hotels, etc. I think I spent less in total than it's going to cost for just the flight to Australia, because flights to Australia are expensive. Yeah, we haven't reached 420,000 subscribers yet. Right. Oh, and I guess, spoiler alert for the 279 or whatever of you who are around tonight. Spoiler alert, at some point in the next 2 months-ish, I think, if I've got my maths right, I will hopefully be joined by my own fluffy research assistant. That should be fun. So yes, there will be a little puppy around, but fortunately, thanks to his breed, he will probably just be chilling rather than running around trying to chew all my cables. So you'll see him along at some point. Chris Southgate, are any of the conferences going to be streamed? The WHNA or WNHA, I can never get it the right way around, conference segments are actually, most of them, I think pretty much most of them were recorded. There were a few technical issues in 1 or 2, but they have been recorded. They are going up one after the other on the WHNA YouTube channel, or Western Naval Historical Association, WNHA YouTube channel. They've done, I think, pretty much all of the first day's morning ones, which means my one should be going up in the next few days, because I was the first one in the afternoon of the first day, which you'll find hilarious because it's going to be, you know, as the YouTuber, the one who works the most with computers, it was also the presentation that started off with the most technical issues, but there you go. And I will add my one to the collaborations playlist as well, so you'll be able to see it. So hopefully that'll be quite interesting. It's basically a kind of how and why I started YouTube and how it's going for the audience that was at the conference, who obviously were interested in how I'm applying naval history to a social media digital environment. More sort of maritime naval history type presentations will hopefully follow in subsequent conferences. People suggesting the dog's name. No, I have already decided on the dog's name. The dog name, the dog already exists, actually. I do have some on my phone. I do actually have some videos, because he has already been born. He is a puppy, but obviously he needs to stay with his litter mates and his mother for a while. I have decided he shall be called the grand name of Flopatron 9000. Yes, that is my decision, and I'm sticking to it. He will be a deerhound, so he will get large, but he will initially be small. Well, ish. U5, Madeline Dale, I'll be at U505 at some point in September, probably mid-September. I don't know exactly when, as yet. Yeah, people questioning Flopatron 9000. This is the thing. It's my dog. I can name it what I like, because apparently somebody decided that I'm an adult. I'm not entirely sure who, and whoever it is probably deeply regretting that decision, but they can't take it back. Yes, this is it's one of those rare things where you suddenly get reminded that, oh yeah, as an adult, society has very little say on what you do about an awful lot of stuff that you're not allowed to do as you like when you're younger. I will finish off by regaling you of what I term the first time I realised I was an adult, and I may have told this story before, so if you have heard it before, I apologise. But that's my it's my live stream. I can tell you what I like, really. But this was kind of the thing. So, for those of you in the UK, you may have heard of Cheddar Gorge. For those of you who are outside of the UK, you probably think it's something to do with cheese, and you would actually be right, it is where cheddar cheese is from. But Cheddar Gorge, as the name suggests, is a big cleft in the landscape. And at the top of the... sorry, there was a creaking over there every time I speak. At the top of Cheddar Gorge, at the top of the cutting, is a series of caves. They're actually really good if you ever find yourself in the area. Go exploring in them. There's the public area. They found some very old remains of people in there, like thousands of years old. But there's also there's actually the full-on caving experience that you can do separately. That's also really good. I do that every time. And there's some museums and stuff. But the point is, that's at the top. Most of the parking is at the bottom. So you park and you walk up the gorge, and of course loads of shops have opened up along there, and various other small museums and so forth. So, as befits a relatively sunny area of Britain, it's in southwest Britain, there's a lot of shops that sell ice cream, either dedicated ice cream shops or cafes that also sell ice cream. And when I was a kid and we went there a few times, obviously I'd be like, I want an ice cream from this shop and this shop and this shop and this shop. And my parents were like, no, you get one ice cream. And if you're very, very good, you might get a second one at the end of the day. Then I went back there for the first time as an over 18 with Mrs. Drack about, what was this? This was about 6 months after we got married, I think. And I was telling her about this and my sort of my childish desire back in the day to eat all the ice cream. And we were walking up from the car park, and then I looked at her and went, hang on a minute. We're adults. I have money in my wallet. Technically, there is nothing anyone can do to stop me from eating an ice cream at every single shop on the way up. And Mrs. Drack was like, no, you're right. Well, except for the fact you'll probably be horribly and violently sick, at which point I was just like, watch me, and promptly went and ate 24 ice creams in the space of about an hour and a half as we meandered our way up Cheddar Gorge. And I know I was not sick, but I tormented my my small group of people on my private Facebook account at the time, because every couple of minutes I was like, and here's another ice cream, and here's another ice cream, and here's another one. And here's another one. And yes, when I got to the top, I was like, now I'm going caving with basically a stomach full of ice cream, which was also fun. So yeah, these are the wonderful little things you get to do as an adult that you never think you're going to be able to do as a kid. You might want to do as a kid, but usually by the time you're an adult, you forget. And so yeah, stuff like eating insane amounts of ice cream or getting to name your dog a completely silly name are the wonders of supposed adulthood. Yeah, so yes, we do have a we do have the sun in Britain. It does show up occasionally. Right, so I shall pick a... Okay, we'll just do one or two quick questions. So Liv asking, do you worry that historical studies are getting too clinical and erudite and losing a sense of romance and wonder, like alternate histories being shut down because they didn't happen? Some elements of naval history are going that way, but they always do. For the minute, I don't think it's a massive threat. Certainly not as long as people like myself and you lot are around here to you know, keep a little bit of the liveliness going. Scooter JSP, any chance of you and Dr. Clark doing a collab video with Shadiversity while you're in Australia, maybe on medieval naval warfare? I have no idea where in Australia Shad is based or if he would be in any way interested, but you know, I'm usually open for most collabs if people are happy to talk about something that we have a mutual interest in. We'll just have to, we shall have to see. I will be meeting up with Rex's hangar, so we'll probably find a naval aircraft of some description to talk about. Knight 6831 saying Drac stream will be shorter than Dr. Clark's stream and the BA stream. Well, you know, I started later and I do want some sleep before I need to get back to making videos. So that is going to be that. And thank you very much everybody for listening. I know it's been a slightly smaller numbers stream than usual. As I said, I think that's probably because of the fact that I only put the notices up about half an hour before I actually went live, but there you go. And once again, if you do happen to be on Patreon and can help me figure out where I'm actually standing with Patreon questions, that would be great. But we have now been going for quite some time, and so I shall bid you all adieu. See you later.